Chapter 93. Amidst the mocking gazes, the newly promoted, tasting challenger, counted the disaster coins in his hand. Contrary to what everyone expected, he did not immediately go to the bar to order a glass of wine. Instead, he took the money bag and went straight out of the True Fragrance wine shop. "The treatment fee is here, please count it." He came to the center of the town, which was developed from a wartime medical camp into a hospital-like place. He found the spellcaster responsible for casting healing spells for the wounded and handed over the disaster coins he exchanged with his life. The spellcaster doctor did not carefully count the money like he did before. He just shook the money bag with his hand and put it into his arms. Then, he calmly took out the materials needed for casting spells from the various cloth pockets he carried with him and cast the Remove Curse spell on a young wounded man. This ranger was affected by the laws of this layer of the abyss when he was patrolling, and his body was parasitized by the acid worm. You know very well that your friend was already unconscious when you sent him here. The money just now was only enough to pay for the surgery to remove a few of the worms. In order to cure the influence of the abyss, I just cast the Remove Curse on him. You still need to collect twice the amount of disaster coins. I will only carry out the next step of treatment after I receive the money. After saying these words, the spellcaster doctor no longer paid attention to the strong man in front of him. He did not look back and walked to the next patient who came to pay the fee. The person he was talking to looked at the young ranger who was lying on the couch. Then, he bent his slightly numb hand. It was not that Viper's hemostasis did not affect him in the slightest. It was just that in order to save a life, he had no choice but to earn that money. He turned around and was ready to go to the True Fragrance wine shop to try his luck. However, before he could take more than a few steps, he was blocked by a palm in his path. "You are a paladin." Following the words of the person who blocked him, a powerful healing spell accurately hit the wounded ranger lying on the small bed in the corner of the room. After trying his best to open his eyes, Jensen recognized that it was the young man who had once fought side by side with him, the commander of Fort Bator transformed from a megalosaurus. That's right, the drunkard who had been wandering in the tavern for almost 2 years was Jason, the Saint Samurai who broke out of the tyrant worm's body and showed his might in the final battle of the fortress. However, after unsealing the silent dictum and unleashing his powerful strength, he had indeed violated the creed of the god of justice and law. Ever since the great retreat from Fort Bator, Jensen had never heard the teachings of the god he worshipped in the depths of his heart. Due to the regret that he had yet to complete his revenge, coupled with the regret that he had chosen to escape rather than fight to the death in the end, his will continued to be depressed, and he could only rely on alcohol to numb himself. It wasn't until he met a young ranger who was lying on the ground, whom he had met a few times before, and who was called Barton's Boy by the boss of Broombrows, that the former Saint Samurai regained his spirit. In order to save his life, he had to raise the medical expenses for the young man to receive magic treatment in the non-wartime medical camp. In the past, he didn't have to do this. The holy power of the Saint Samurai could effectively suppress most evil curses, and he only needed to pass some of it to the ranger who was suffering from the parasitic curse of the acid mist worm. Jensen was well aware that his god refused to respond to him, and it was precisely because of this that he had been dispirited. In desperation, he had to go to the True Fragrance Tavern to participate in a trial drinking bet, betting his life for the young man's life-saving money. Seeing that the ranger was coughing slightly after being hit by the powerful healing spell and was beginning to regain consciousness and expelling the last remnants of the curse power in his body, Jensen showed a grateful look to the young blue dragon in front of him. "I'm no longer a Saint Samurai," he said, trying to bypass Keys and leave. Was there a Saint Samurai first, or was there a god first? Keys didn't try to stop Jensen from leaving. Instead, he asked this question with his back facing him. Not long ago, While waiting for Buru to pack up his belongings and inventory of his business in the Acid Mist Canyon, Keyes and his companions saw Jensen participating in the trial drinking bet through the mirror crystal used to monitor the internal business of the True Fragrance Tavern. The young blue dragon recognized the powerful paladin who had once fought side by side with him at a glance. However, the current decadent appearance of the paladin could not be overlapped with the heroic appearance of the paladin in Quest's memory. Driven by curiosity, he quietly followed Jensen as he walked out of the True Fragrance Tavern with a bag of money. That was why he stopped Jensen from leaving and helped him directly. Keyes could easily see through people's hearts after receiving the legacy of the Wise One of the Gith. He could easily feel the shackles in Jensen's heart, the regret that he couldn't complete his revenge, the regret that the gods had abandoned him. Even under such circumstances, Jensen was still willing to risk his life for someone who had little to do with him. Keyes knew that if he were to suffer the same blow, he would never be able to do what Jensen did. Although the powerful warrior was now in a state of depression, he still had something that was ingrained in his blood and bones. Such things weren't unique in the entire multiverse, but they were still rare, and scarcity was one of the most important prerequisites for an item to be valuable. Out of the Megalosaurus nature of collecting valuable items, the young blue dragon decided to help Jensen instead of letting the jade be covered in dust. Well, this wasn't a betrayal of the lawful evil faction. When it came to valuable items, the old dragon Sirota taught all the blue dragon descendants in the dragon lair to kill without fail. Keyes mentally prepared himself. Because the young blue dragon's words contained a trace of the skill of the psionic ability, it easily stirred up the emotions of the former paladin. Jensen, who was striding out, suddenly turned around and glared at the young Megalosaurus. Although he could no longer receive the god's pity, he still couldn't tolerate such blasphemous words. However, Keyes, who turned back to look at him, still said in a calm tone, "Obviously, the answer to this question isn't too hard to find. After all, it's not like the question of which came first, the chicken or the egg. The history of the paladin profession far exceeds that of most of the gods. In fact, many of them were paladins before they became god." Although Jensen wanted to refute these words after thinking about it, he realized that it was indeed an indisputable fact. Even in the training before becoming a paladin, the paladin seniors who taught him about faith had taken out books and pointed out similar words for him to memorize. If some of the words before made you feel uncomfortable, I apologize. I promise that what I'm about to say is just some of my understanding of the paladins. You shouldn't object to this. With the help of the psionic ability, Keyes extinguished Jensen's attempt to organize some objections. The young blue dragon continued to persuade Jensen with a more acceptable topic. "I saw the scene of you drinking the viper hemostasis. If you don't admit that you're still a paladin, then there's no way to explain the situation where you're fine after drinking the poisoned wine. You don't know, but in fact, when the bone demon bartender added ice to the 2 glasses of poisoned wine, he deliberately dripped some of the venom from his tail into the glasses. That's a highly toxic poison that ordinary paladins can't withstand, and you're only slightly paralyzed. Unless you have the direct bloodline of a powerful heavenly creature within 3 generations, there's only one possibility. The holy power that can give paladins a special constitution far beyond that of mortals hasn't abandoned you at all. This hidden power in your body not only hasn't weakened, but also far surpasses ordinary paladins." Keyes's words were like a bell that directly shocked Jensen. He didn't even realize that his thoughts were closely following the words of the young blue dragon in front of him. "But I really can't listen to the teachings of the God of justice and law in the depths of my heart?" Without waiting for him to finish, Keyes, who had completely grasped the rhythm of the conversation, interrupted. "The holy power of a paladin does need the guidance of the gods, but it doesn't directly come from the gods. Where does the holy power of those paladins come from? According to the knowledge inheritance of the Megalosaurus race, the holy power is actually a direct gift from the rule of goodness, the basic rule of the multiverse, after practicing good deeds. It's not just justice and law. As long as you persist in practicing a series of good deeds such as humility, honesty, compassion, bravery, sacrifice, and a series of good deeds, you'll receive the holy power as a gift. The holy power is the foundation to create a paladin, and whether the holy power respects kindness is the standard to measure whether a paladin has failed in his duty. Seeing the light of hope shining in Jensen's originally cloudy eyes, Keyes struck while the iron was hot. You can't listen to the teachings of the God you worship, and it's true that existence has temporarily blocked the pity for you, but this doesn't mean that you're not a paladin. The thought of goodness is still overflowing in the depths of your soul, and your hands can still wield the sword to protect goodness, and the holy power has always been with you. The temporary blocking of the God is just a test, and all you have to do is to persist in your path and wait patiently. So, with that, Keyes took out a contract scroll that he had already prepared. Repaying kindness is one of the standards of a paladin, and I've just helped you to practice good deeds. According to the fee that the doctor just mentioned, and given that the spells I used are much more advanced than what he could use, you owe me some calamity coins. Considering your current ability to repay, let's sign an employment contract and work in lieu of payment. Don't worry, I won't let you do anything that goes against your principles, and after paying off the debt, if you want to renew the contract, you'll be treated well. I know that you can use some of the holy words of creation, and when you sign this contract, you can read it in this language to check if I'm lying. Jensen, who didn't know whether to laugh or cry at the sudden 180-degree turn of the young man in front of him, signed the employment contract a little helplessly. However, he didn't know what a certain Demolic, who had a similar experience and signed a labor contract, but was actually a slave contract, would feel after learning about the existence of this contract. Chapter 94. For lower world creatures like demons and devils, as long as they weren't killed, this was the fate of most of them. In theory, there was no upper limit to their lifespan. It was for this reason that these creatures still had a sense of time, unless it was something that directly or indirectly affected their own interests. At other times, a mere few years was no different from the blink of an eye in their eyes. Fortunately, this was the case. In addition, the invasion of the Bartholomew 9 Hells in the plain of Acid Fog Canyon had been relatively smooth for the past 2 years. Previously, Quess had been granted the benefits of returning to his original world and temporarily withdrawing from the Blood War to recuperate according to the wartime recuperation regulations and other policies. After bidding farewell to the Goblin Golem duo, who still had to observe the battlefield in Acid Fog Canyon, Keyes first led the 3 Ogre brothers, as well as Half-Lich Snader and Sacred Samurai Jensen, who had signed employment contracts with him, back to the first level of Avernus through Hell's Gate Fortress. After showing his Medal of Merit as proof, Keyes and the others were granted the right to use the portal that connected the material plane to the 9 prisons of Bader. The portal they were about to pass through was guarded by an Anzu demon who was in charge of overseeing traffic to and from the Hell's Gate. Apart from the slightly stricter inspection of the paladins when they passed through the portal, the others were allowed to pass through quickly. That was why Kith did not choose to provoke this middle-ranked demon who had a strong sense of self-esteem and was addicted to power. The party smoothly passed through Avernus and arrived at the original material plane that Keyes and the 3 Ogre brothers hadn't seen for 2 years. The scene that greeted them after they stepped out of the interplanar teleportation portal surprised them. This place wasn't a dark underground cave, nor was it the residence of an evil mage. Unlike what they had imagined, this outpost of the 9 prisons of Bader was actually a tailor's shop that stored all sorts of cloth. The portal they had just walked out of was hidden in a large full-length mirror on the 2nd floor of the tailor's shop. It was still a little cramped for the ogres, who had to bend their backs and lower their heads to get out of the mirror. Thump, thump, thump. Seeming to have sensed the faint magical waves emanating from the portal, a middle-aged woman who looked like the shopkeeper of a tailor's shop walked up the stairs from the corner of the room. When she saw the people who walked out of the portal and knew where the door led to, she immediately put on a vigilant and fawning expression. "Welcome, everyone. Please excuse me for not going out to meet you." The young blue dragon didn't want to waste his breath. He took out the pass that ancestral demon unstamped when he left the Avernus transit station on the first level of Bator. With such a hard-to-forge endorsement of hell, the tailor shop owner, who was in charge of the Bartho outpost, naturally did not want to investigate further. Who knew if this person had some secret mission? As a peripheral member who only had half of the Inferno bloodline, it was not wise to rashly get involved. "Is this within the territory of the Medici Empire, female tiefling?" Keyes asked casually as he stepped onto the prime material plane that he hadn't seen for 2 years. His nerves that were always tense gradually relaxed after the bloody battlefield. Although she was surprised that the young man in front of her, who came from a big place, like the 9 prisons of Bator, knew about the Medici Empire, located in a remote part of the multiverse, the female tailor, who was disguised as a tiefling, quickly replied, "My lord, this is indeed the Coptic city of the Medici Empire." So it was here. No wonder Keyes felt a little strange just now. This tailor's shop did not have any windows. There were only a few oil lamps placed on the walls as light sources. This was a characteristic of the cavernous houses in Coptic City. This city, which was developed on the ruins of the ancient halfling, would be baptized by a terrible desert tornado every year. Except for the low houses that were excavated by the ancient halfling, any other city buildings that were more than 5 feet above the ground would be destroyed by the tornado. As a result, the city developed a peculiar architectural custom. All the buildings were built on the foundation of the halflings' cavernous houses. They excavated downwards to expand the space, and many tunnels were dug between the various underground cavernous houses to connect them. Over time, the underground buildings here were connected, forming a huge underground city with streets, squares, and underground rivers. The earliest humans who lived here were all criminals exiled from the Medici Empire. Coupled with the underground crisscrossing roads and the underground network that no one knew about, all kinds of crimes flowed in this place. This was the city of sin in the hearts of every Medici. It was the only city where Pharaoh did not appoint a governor. But it was undeniable that this city of sin, located in the heart of the desert, had a kind of abnormal prosperity. All kinds of villains, as well as all kinds of transactions that were banned in other places in Medici, brought a strange vitality to the city. Once, there was a lich who was similar to Kitha's subordinate, Snade's employee, who tried to dominate the city. However, not long after, he was annihilated by the elite spellcasters of the Empire because he angered Medica's Grand Vexil, Prime Minister. His phylactery was also pulled out and smashed, and thrown into a cesspool as a warning to others. At that time, Coptic City was also razed by Medici's army. But as the saying went, wildfire can never burn it out, but it will grow again when the spring breeze blows. The underground network of tunnels hid the seeds of sin in the city. After the withdrawal of Medici's army, the city was restored to its original state in a few years. However, the underground order was no longer under the sole control of a powerful figure. Instead, the Council of 10 was formed by the most influential figures in the city. They took over the responsibility of managing the city from the previous unlucky lich. 2 years ago, Keyes, who was a fledgling, saved a gnome city merchant who had the moon candy synthesis scroll. At that time, the young blue dragon smelled the scent of the Batsu devil on the scroll. Presumably, the scroll should have been leaked from this Batsu outpost. As for the conspiracy that the unlucky lich encountered, it probably had something to do with this place. I don't know what happened to Santos Ben Joser. It's been 2 years. Some of the companies that received venture capital in my previous life could even be listed. I should arrange for the return of the investment as soon as possible. I don't know if that guy has given up on that evil business, Keyes thought as he turned back and smiled at his newly hired employee. If he doesn't sell contraband and honestly gives me the return of the investment as a return, I'll let it go. Otherwise, it's certainly not against the principles of the Paladins to collect debts from evil merchants. It's a good opportunity for the new employee to show his talent. Maybe it will help improve the team's cohesion. Returning to the familiar plane did indeed make Keyes feel a lot more relaxed. Even if this was the worst city in the Medici Empire, it was still 10,000 times better than the bloody front line of the underworld. The young blue dragon was happy with his foresight and wisdom. He waved his hand and asked his companions to leave. Ignoring the female tiefling's proposal to arrange a guide, the young blue dragon planned to take advantage of the time to explore the underground city. Coming out of the tailor's shop, the group walked in a wide tunnel that served as the main road of Coptic City. This tunnel had obviously been expanded and reinforced many times. Its height was enough for a giant to walk upright with his chest puffed out. Its width was still more than enough for a group of people to walk side by side. Every 10 steps, there would be an alley that connected to other crypt buildings on both sides of the main road. The entrances of these alleys were often decorated with unique lighting, which not only showed the function of the crypt buildings in the alleys, but also provided the necessary illumination for the main road. However, unlike Keyes and his companions who strolled leisurely, most of the pedestrians who were in a hurry chose to firmly hide their faces with their hoods. They trotted all the way into the dark depths of unknown alleys. This place is somewhat similar to Morspleight, but it's very different. Wandering in this underground city, he gradually recalled some things from many years ago. He was originally impatient with this kind of stroll. The environment here evoked the memories of the Demolica's hometown. Morspleight was also an underground city, but it was deeper and darker than this place. After a long period of contact with mechanical puppet number 21, the Demolic was unknowingly influenced by it. Under the strong encouragement of that guy, Snyder completely transformed the terrifying armor of the living automaton into his own body. Not only that, but the mechanical puppet also invited the great goblin engineer Riknaz to provide him with some technical support. After several modifications, Snyder's steel body was equipped with a small high-pressure steam power furnace, a pneumatic transmission device, and a Decepticon logo painted by mechanical puppet number 21. According to the mechanical puppet, this was a mysterious totem that few people knew about and could effectively improve mechanical efficiency. For such a person, who was very likely the first steampunk-style lich in the multiverse, to be able to say such sentimental words, it really made Keyes sigh in his heart at the power of distortion of mechanical puppet number 21's faction. I hope that the strange mechanical puppet and its rigorous and reliable great goblin engineer friend can safely survive the rest of their bloody battle observation tour, Keyes silently wished in his heart. In addition to the pedestrians coming and going, there were also some homeless people on both sides of the Coptic street. Like the pedestrians who walked as if they were flying, most of these people used hoods to hide their faces in the shadows. These homeless people could be people who had recently escaped from other places to seek a living here, or they could be the city's bankrupt people. Their existence was precisely a symbol of the city's cycle of alternating between the old and the new, that is, come here, seek hope, obtain success, encounter failure. It was this endless process, similar to the human body's metabolism, that gave this city a different kind of vitality. Of course, the adventurers who came to this city of sin did not all end in failure. As long as they were lucky enough to enter the Council of Ten, then failure would only come after death. Chapter 95. Megalosaurus were born with a keen sense of smell. The smell of any person or object would leave a clear memory in their brain. At this moment, Quith stopped beside a wanderer who was curled up in the corner of the street. Although there was a leather-hooded robe and the wanderer had not washed his body for many days, the young blue dragon was still very sure that the smell emitted from the wanderer belonged to a person he had seen before. The bulging muscles under the robe seemed to support his guess. "Hello, Mr. Brock. I'm an elven supreme warrior from Salem. The boy's soft greeting sounded like a sudden clap of thunder in the ears of the snoring wanderer. The powerful elf, who was both a supreme warrior and a sound warlock, leaped up from the ground and extended 2 scimitars from his robe. In a split second, he was ready to attack and defend against Keys and the others. He raised his hand to stop the burly ogre, who was about to rush forward with his ebony spikes, and the steampunk Demolic, who was about to launch a preemptive strike and cast a spell. Quest calmly observed the elven powerhouse in front of him, whom he had met once before. He had to admit that things were still the same, but the people had changed. His 2 muscular arms that were exposed outside the robe were covered with scars that had just healed not long ago. The eyes that were staring at them from under the hood were still sharp, but not as bright as they were in Lin Sanjia's memories. At this moment, the 2 elven scimitars in his hands were densely covered with dents of various sizes. It was obvious that the 2 weapons were close to exhaustion, just like their owner. "You are that Megalosaurus, Your Excellency?" Brock, who was once Salem's tongue-taker, seemed to have recognized the person who had just greeted him. Although 2 years of bloody battles had made Keys stronger and taller in his human form, his face had not changed much. Moreover, the 3 ogres beside him had very distinctive appearances. Brock did not let his guard down after recognizing the person. However, he did not want to provoke a Megalosaurus who might not be an enemy. So, the powerful elf asked carefully, "Are you here to kill me under Harknan's orders?" Harknan, another familiar name. Keys remembered that the 4th son of the Salem tribe's Khan was a fat sheep who had given him thousands of silver cats. "Of course not. On the contrary," he said with interest as he waved his hand and activated the powerful force field control inherited from the Energon dragon. A tabby cat hiding in the shadows not far away was pulled over. "I can also provide you with some help, such as if he had turned into a cat lover." The young blue dragon bent his finger slightly and flicked the frightened kitten twice under the restraint of the field. "You were hit by 1 of my attacks, shame on me. You were hit by 2 of my attacks, shame on you. Don't you think so?" The terrified tabby cat's expression immediately changed when it heard the words. Its eyes flashed with an emotion called anger as it stared at the culprit in front of it. However, this anger was followed by a 3rd flick. Under the force field effect of Keys's flick, the cat that was trapped in the force field was sent flying and crashed into the walls on both sides of the road. Fortunately, as the force field on its body was removed, the tabby cat's 4 limbs kicked off the wall and landed firmly on the ground. With a roar, the little guy immediately removed the disguise on its body. A creature that looked like a warcat with bestiality appeared on the spot. However, it only looked like a warcat. Its abnormal palm that was the opposite of a human's exposed its true nature. It was a Rakshasa. Rakshasa, also known as demonic beasts and ghosts. This was a kind of beta creature that had released its soul from the body of a demon through a dark ritual. It was able to break free from the shackles of the underworld and come to the material plane to satisfy its desire for the flesh and blood of humanoid creatures. At the moment when the dark ritual was completed, they were no longer Batsu Devil. Therefore, they no longer had the usual resistance bonus of the demons, and spell-like abilities such as Summon Batsu. Of course, there were gains and losses. Not only did this creature obtain the ability to freely leave the 9 prisons of Bader, it could also disguise itself as any appearance it wanted. Very few creatures could see the true form of a Rakshasa. They also preferred to disguise themselves as some powerful or influential people, such as nobles of extraordinary birth, bishops who served God, or wealthy merchants. Even if someone occasionally saw their true form, it was easy to be deceived by their appearance that was a mixture of human and tiger features, and mistake them for a warcat. However, this kind of disguise could not fool Keys. After all, this young blue dragon was a man who had personally commanded a Batsu army. Although most of them were just mercenaries from another plane. Keys's words that angered the Rakshasa were not nonsense. There was such a maxim among the Rakshasa: being stabbed once by you, shame on you; being stabbed twice by you, shame on me. This kind of Batsu creature had a very strong vengeful mentality. The only remaining characteristic of the Batsu was that it would not really die after being killed in the material plane. After a few months or a few years, its body would be reconstructed. When the Rakshasa was reborn, it still retained all the knowledge and memories of its previous life. It used this knowledge to find the person who killed it, and then cruel revenge called punishment. If the target was out of its control for some reason, such as death, the Rakshasa would turn its revenge on the target's family, friends, and descendants. Of course, it did not disguise itself as a tabby cat to ambush here to seek revenge. It was just carrying out its mission, to kill tongue-taker Brock. And this was the second layer of disguise of the Batsu outpost, disguised as a tailor shop, the daily business of an assassin's union. Although it was angered by the sudden turn of events and transformed, this Rakshasa was not a reckless person. Actually, the Rakshasa was quite skilled at judging the situation. After considering the fact that the person who angered it was capable of toying with it, as well as seeing the group of people standing next to Keys who seemed to be untouchable, the Rakshasa could only think about how to escape unscathed. This Tiger Man. No matter how slow Brock was, it would have been impossible for him to not realize that the Tigerman's target was himself when he saw the tabby cat suddenly transform into a humanoid creature. He's a Rakshasa, not a Tiger Man. The blue dragon youth who had transformed into a humanoid form interrupted the elf's words and revealed the Rakshasa's true identity. Go back and tell that tiefling that I have a use for this elf. If she has any questions, she can come and find me personally, if she dares. A Batsu creature had appeared in the city where the Batsu outpost was located. Keys did not even need to think to know that there was a connection between the two. However, he did have some other thoughts when he saved Blatch this time. After returning to the material plane, he had thought about exploring the ruins of the ancient Amaska civilization. Now, he was thinking about it again. Chapter 96. The dark-colored wool is soft and dense, and it can help you resist the cold of the night. The light-colored sari is comfortable and breathable, and you don't have to worry about the sweat at noon. Oh, threading a needle, the tough silk thread is thinner than the bowstring. Oh, playing with scissors, the sharpened scissors are sharper than the machete. The tape measure and chalk are ready to measure your clothes at any time. If you ask, how much is this decent? I can only tell you secretly. The price is the cheapest here. The advertisement of the decent tailor shop. After dissuading the Rakshasa demon who came to perform the entrusted task in a half-physical and half-verbal way, Keys nodded to the elven powerhouse whom he knew before. Under the powerful aura of the young blue dragon and his companions, Brock had to put away his machete and followed the crowd to the periphery of the city from a fork in the road. Although the permanent buildings of Coptic City were underground, it did not mean that the surface of the earth above the city was only bare tomb-like roof. The merchants who came and went only needed to pay a daily fee to the Council of 10 that ruled the city, and they had the right to use felt to set up temporary tents as stalls to sell their goods. These densely packed stalls even formed a huge bazaar that spread into the depths of the desert. The Council of 10 also arranged a security team composed of their respective slaves to maintain the order here. When Keys and his party walked out of the crypt city, the sun was setting in the west. At this moment, the big bazaar attracted a lot of people because of the cool weather. The bustling crowd showed the vitality of the place. Under the urging of the ogre gourmet, the crowd stopped in front of a restaurant that specialized in making camel barbecue. It was located near the periphery of the big bazaar, and not far away, there was a sea of sand that seemed to stretch endlessly. Among the people who returned from the bloody battlefield, the one who gained the most was undoubtedly Keys, but when it came to the extent of the expansion of the purse, it was Brew who led the pack. In order to withstand the attack of the demon army, The young blue dragon had sacrificed himself after being airdropped into the bottomless abyss. He had relied on a large number of silver-containing artillery shells and silver-plated weapons to persevere until the end. Now, apart from some stock of the railgun shells in his space belt, the large amount of silver he exchanged with the merchants of Yugoloth was left in the plain of the Acid Fog Canyon. As for the reward and compensation for the commander's allowance after the opening of Hellgate Fortress, they were all directly given out in the Soul Prism, the hard currency of the lower world. Keyes, who had been in the process of self-adapting and passively evolving, had not had the time to exchange for it with the merchants of Yugoloth. But the smart brew was different. In the later stages of his life, he invested in a tavern and operated a hospital in the abyss town formed by mercenaries. This ogre gourmet could be said to have completed the primitive accumulation of capital in the abyss, which was truly a barren land. Due to the customer base, most of them would not use a high-grade item like the Soul Prism during settlement. In addition to some materials and items obtained through bartering, Brew's purse was not short of gold coins, which were called calamity coins by the lower world creatures. Therefore, when Keyes awkwardly found that he did not have any coins to pay with, the ogre gourmet generously took out 2 calamity coins from his small purse and handed them to the owner of the tavern. In the Ash Plain, the exchange rate between gold coins and silver coins was more than 100. Silver coins were the main equivalent in this world, and very few people were generous enough to use gold coins for transactions. The owner of the tavern smiled and assured everyone that the stall would be booked for the night, and no one would disturb them. But under Keyes's signal, the cautious steampunk Demolic, who had no interest in food, cast a spell that could shield him from detection. At the same time, he summoned a spying eye to hide around the tavern. "Mr. Brock, if you don't mind, can you tell me about the grudge between you and Huck Nan? After all, I have been away from worldly affairs for more than 2 years." The young blue dragon inadvertently used some psionic skills in his words, which gave him a great advantage when persuading others. "I remember that he is your friend Anda, the 4th son of Salem Khan, and you personally saved him from my hands." Unexpectedly, when Keyes heard the last sentence of "friend of Anda," he could clearly feel the emotions hidden deep in the elf's heart gushing out like a mountain peak. It was a complicated emotion mixed with hatred, sadness, nostalgia, and more self-blame. The powerful elf named Tongue Taker took a few deep breaths to calm the fire in his heart. Taking a bite of the half-roasted camel meat that had not yet been sprinkled with spices, Blatch chewed hard and swallowed the food in his mouth. Slowly, he said, "Hakonan does not deserve to be the son of the great Hadjar Alto. He is a kingslayer, a patricide, a despicable thief that I will curse even after I die." Was it because of the telepathic suggestion? Or was it because he had suppressed it for too long and needed to find someone to talk to? The young blue dragon took a sip of jujube and felt that it was not to his taste, so he changed to a cup of hibiscus juice and continued to sip. At this time, he was playing the role of an excellent listener. Among the crowd, the ogre gourmet and his brother Nalu were busy attacking the roasted camel meat on the bonfire. Only the ogre witch doctor, who had a quiet personality, looked over curiously. Although the paladin Jensen could not speak the language, he could still read something from the angry look of the elf in front of him. Fortunately, Snader, who was sitting beside him, was kind enough to cast a language proficiency spell on this junior employee. Jensen also joined the ranks of the listeners. Brock had been attacked by many rumors since he was young because of his fierce appearance. When he grew older, he used his own hands to stop the rumors and gained the fierce name, Tongue Taker. It was obvious that he hated the behavior of spreading gossip. When the listeners showed interest in his words, Brock instinctively felt conflicted. However, in the depths of his soul that he could not detect, Quest's psionic power was still influencing him silently. "For the Venerable One, for the Sage One, for the Sage One, for the Disease One, for the Family One." But the venerable is dead, the sage is gone, and the loved ones are gone. Only this despicable man, Huck, stole the throne of the Khan. What else is there to hide? Everything started 2 years ago. In Salem, Blatch, who held the two honorable titles of a supreme warrior and a sound sorcerer, was willing to take the risk of great humiliation for his friend, Anda, who was the chief of the tribe. He personally went out to redeem Harknan, the defeated and captured chief's son and his only remaining apprentice. Blatch had thought that under the whiplash of his fists and feet, Huck would be able to be courageous and use his achievements on the battlefield to regain the title of Supreme Warrior and wash away the shameful label that had been placed on him because of his captivity. In fact, Huck did perform well at the beginning. The son of the tribal chief repeatedly took the lead in the war against the Sawan tribe. After leading his army to win several glorious victories for Salem, Huck was once again awarded the title of a Supreme Warrior. But the good times did not last long. This situation that made Brock feel comforted came to an abrupt end when a tragedy occurred. He did not know that the information he revealed about Salem's secret weapon, the blazing shadow beast, when he redeemed Huck, had been sent to the enemy's golden tent by Epicurus, who had been secretly communicating with the Sawan tribe. After learning the true intention of Salem to start the war chief of the Sawan tribe naturally made a targeted plan. He targeted Salem's target, the oil wells that were rich in black oil within the territory of his tribe. He deliberately revealed a flaw on the battlefield and finally succeeded in luring a large cavalry army into a trap. That night, the oil wells that were ignited lit up the desert night. The soaring flames desperately licked at the Salem cavalry, who were at a loss. In less than an hourglass time, the army was completely wiped out. Only a few lucky ones risked their lives to rush out of the sea of fire and brought this disastrous news to their old king. Hajar Alto, the chief of the Salem elves, who had the ambition to become the leader of all the desert elves, had not only lost a powerful arm on his path to becoming the Khan, but he had also lost his other son. This friend of Anda, who was 10 times more tenacious and brave than himself in the eyes of tongue-taker Brock, aged in an instant that night. The traces of his tears wetting his shirt were still eye-catching when he was summoned by Jun Qianzhao the next day. What was even more difficult for Brock to accept was the fact that he was arranged in the inner room of the Sawan tribe. Sheikh Sawan has learned about the matters related to Salem's blazing shadow beast from a merchant. Merchant, blazing shadow beast, related matters, these words deeply stabbed Brock's rock-hard heart. He knew that this mistake was leaked by him. He had to bear the main responsibility for the destruction of the tribal army and the loss of his beloved son in Anda. But when he told the truth and asked his chief for a quick death as punishment, his friend just said, "You accidentally hurt my other son in order to save one of my sons. I don't blame you. If you die, I will lose 2 close relatives in a day." Although Brock was forgiven by his friend, self-blame still gnawed at the heart of Tongue-Taker. That night, he could no longer hold back and went to the golden tent to ask his old friend for an order. He wanted to personally hunt down the merchant who passed on the message. After killing that Epicurus, I will assassinate the chief of the Sawan tribe. If he dies, that's good. If he doesn't, I will bring his head back and kill myself. Brock thought to himself as he walked to the entrance of the golden tent. But the moment he pushed open the golden tent's curtain, he saw a scene that made his eyes pop out of their sockets. His disciple, the only son of his friend, the son of the chief named Harknan, had stabbed a dagger into his old father's heart. When he saw his atrocity being exposed, Brock knew that he was far from being his master's opponent. But he didn't know that at that time, Brock was so heartbroken that he almost couldn't pick up his scimitar. The Kingslayer carefully avoided Brock's scimitar and sound spell, which were both out of standard, while shouting loudly. The elven chief wanted to be alone to calm down the guards of the golden tent who had just been sent away. That night, the god of luck must have favored that scoundrel. Just like his previous atrocities, he succeeded once again. and I became the sinner who killed the Khan according to him." Brock's tone was still calm, but the rib of the camel beast that was crushed in his hand revealed his true emotions at that moment. Chapter 97. In the golden tent in the center of the Salem tribe, the new tribal chief, who had just been sworn in less than a month ago, was entrenched in it. Perhaps in order to avoid a repeat of the tragedy that had happened here before, there were two small groups of tribal warriors waiting at the door. But unlike the former tribal chief Hagir, who could easily call out the names of the guards and gossip with them, the young king of the elven tribe always sat on the throne in the deepest part of the tent with a heavy heart. He would sit there for an entire day. Poor Harknan. He just lost his brother who grew up with him, and then he lost his father who sheltered him from the wind and rain. The warrior captain in charge of guarding the tent couldn't help but sigh. But then his thoughts were attracted by an eagle that was circling in the sky. This flying feathered beast was a common postman in the desert. It only needed some fresh meat to send a message across hundreds of miles to the people who needed it. After instructing the others to remain on guard, the warrior captain removed the sealed letter tube from the eagle's leg. In the process of doing this, he had been very careful of the big bird next to him, fearing that it would suddenly peck at him because it was hungry and treat him as food. He had a few unpleasant memories before, so he did not have a good impression of this bad-tempered postman. After checking the tube and confirming that the fire seal was still intact, the warrior captain handed over the task of feeding the eagle to the other warriors. He turned around and lifted the felt cloth in front of the golden tent and strode in. The new tribal chief was sitting on the throne in the deepest part of the tent, one hand supporting his forehead on the table in front of him. Sensing that someone had entered the tent, Harknan immediately stood up. When he saw the person's appearance, he put his hand down from the hilt of his scimitar beside him. "Great Khan, there is a message for you by Eagle." The warrior captain obviously saw Harknan's action, but he didn't panic. He still maintained a calm expression and presented the letter tube with both hands. After receiving permission to leave, the warrior captain bowed and left the slightly haggard tribal chief's golden tent. Harknan picked up a small knife that was specially used to open seals and carefully cleaned the seal on the edge of the tube. He gently knocked the tube and poured the letter on the table in front of him. To Chief Harknan. The words at the beginning of the letter made the young tribal chief quite unhappy. Harknan, who thought that he had inherited the power of the former Salem tribe leader Hagir Alto, naturally also inherited the ambition of becoming the common lord of all the desert elves. He still continued the tribe's habit of exaggerating the tribal chief by calling him Khan, but he didn't expect that in the end, his pride would be hurt by the villain's residence of the desert Coptic Assassins Guild of Assassins. A letter, two pieces of news. One was of very ordinary good news, and the other was extremely bad news. The good news was that the respectable tailor shop had successfully killed Epicurus, the head of the Chamber of Commerce, and his head would be sent to the Salem tribe's golden tent in a few days. The bad news was that the other assassination commission had gone wrong. Brock, who was likely to make Harknan lose face, was rescued by an absolutely powerful person. The Assassins Guild of Assassins would send back the advance payment and compensation for the commission, as well as Epicurus' head. The angry young tribal chief threw the letter high, pulled out his scimitar, and cut the letter into 4 pieces before it fell to the ground. This was the combat skill taught to him by Brock. However, the warrior, whom Harknan wanted to take his head, could cut the letter into 16 pieces in the same time. Don't be blindly angry, especially when the anger comes from the emotion of fear. You have to remember that fear is the killer of the mind. Fear is the little god of death that brings complete destruction. A gentle voice sounded in the young chieftain's head. Although Harknan had tried to reject the voice's advice several times, in the end, he would be defeated by this kind of gentle voice and willingly follow its instructions. It was like this now when he stabbed his father, Khan Hajar Altor, when he framed his master, Brock, with the crime of regicide. Although he had been persuaded by this voice too many times, Harknan still clearly remembered the scene when he first heard this voice. After being redeemed by his master from the Megalosaurus, he did not admit that he was defeated by a profit-seeking merchant. Harknan's self-esteem, which had been cultivated since childhood, suffered a huge blow. As the son of a failed tribal chief, he received more disdain than other people when he returned to the Salem tribe. Although he did not suffer the punishment of being whipped because of his noble birth, this noble was still arranged to do some dirty and dangerous work that only lowly slaves were forced to do. He was personally assigned by Hajar Khan to look after the reproduction of the blazing shade beasts. This son of the tribal chief, who was once the youngest supreme warrior of the Salem tribe, had to work every day in the blazing shade beast's nest with naked slaves. They had to put various materials into the sac-like cavity used to support the growth and development of the blazing shade beast's larvae. At the same time, they had to use sticks to teach the fledgling beasts that had just broken out of their cocoons and had not yet been controlled by the heart of the elven tribal chief to obey simple rules. Those days were the most difficult period of Harknan's life. It was even 100 times more difficult than the training he had received from his strict master. In addition to enduring the heavy labor every day, he also had to breathe the indescribably stinky air inside the nest while carefully avoiding being burned by the blazing heat in the bodies of the fledgling beasts that had been taught the stick education. More than once, he had witnessed slaves who were doing the same work as him accidentally being besieged by the blazing shade beasts and ending up tragically as human charcoal. This painful torture lasted until one day, when a blazing shade beast that had just broken out of its cocoon handed him a crystal that it had held in its mouth before it was born. The cub was much more robust than its peers, but it didn't have the violent tendencies of other newborn beasts to attack wildly. It just quietly walked to Harknan's side, spat out the shimmering crystal in its mouth, and silently turned away. When the son of the tribal chief picked up the crystal spat out by the blazing shade beast, he was not burned as he thought. He had seen many slaves who had made similar mistakes. After the crystal was grasped in his palm, it fit his grip perfectly. A comfortable heat spread from his palm and the crystal to his whole body. It was like a luxury called a steam bath that Harknan had experienced before. The precious water resources in the desert turned into steam and gently brushed across his body. It not only soothed his exhaustion, but also soaked his soul. It was also at that moment that his heart's defense was broken by the ancient consciousness hidden in the crystal. At first, it was just a small piece of gossip that stirred up the mood of the son of the tribal chief. Harknan did not realize that it was the crystal that caused trouble. He only thought that it was the self-talk in his heart because he was too tired. But as these words gradually turned into suggestions, Harknan gradually felt that there was someone in the crystal that he had carried with him since that day. He knew very well that with his wisdom, he could not think of a good way to get out of the current predicament. He could not think of a way to lead the soldiers to win the battle against the Sawan tribe. "Who are you? Why are you hiding here? What do you want to do to me?" Chapter 98. In the art of taming someone, the most important thing is Yao. Once you catch him, you need to use military horses. If you have enough military horses, you can easily make people listen to you. Once you get familiar with the military horses, after you catch Yao, you can talk about things according to the situation and use the military horses. Your eloquence is like a torrent, making people fascinated. Very few people won't fall for it. Technique of 1,000 Men. Preface to the military horse. Harknan's 3 questions flashed in his mind. He began to feel that the gentle voice was not in his ears, but in his heart. As an existence of the past, it doesn't matter who I am. In fact, I have never hidden my existence in front of you. It's just that you have just discovered it. I don't want to do anything to you. Instead, it's you who needs my help. Without any hesitation, the words rang in the mind of the destitute tribal chief's son. Just as he felt that he had been fooled, the voice spoke again. Of course, it sounds insincere. But in fact, I don't know who I am. The only thing that remains in my memory is a rough impression of where I came from. The tower buried under the sand dune, the specialized laboratory where I fiddled with these chimeras. I have to say, the facilities at your place of work are really poor. Hackman could feel that the voice was completely different from before. Or maybe it was him. The voice seemed to have been aroused. It had changed from a person who only revealed a few words occasionally, to now, it was as if he had turned into an eloquent speech expert. Speak too much and lose your temper. This was a principle that Hajar had taught him since he was young. Therefore, the tribal chief's son, who was eager to understand the mysterious voice, did not show any impatience. Instead, he focused on enjoying the performance of the voice. But he had underestimated the power of words. In the mouth of a person who was really good at this, the words that sounded like gossip also had the power to bewitch people. Unknowingly, Hackman was attracted by the ability described by the mysterious voice. He could not hold back the longing and expectation in his heart. In terms of Chimera's research, as I used to be in charge of the spirit binding tower, I have enough knowledge to impart to you. And my bloodline modification technique is even more magical. It can allow you to gain power in a very short period of time that others can never reach in their lifetime. The only thing you need to do is to help me find myself, and find those memories that have been sealed or scattered. Of course, I admit that this is quite a challenge for you in your current situation, but I wouldn't be surprised if you refuse. It's just that you need me, just as I need you. Why don't we rely on each other and work together? Then how should I address you? You can call me by my previous name, Soul Binding Crystal. The beautiful ending of the provocation, the perfect timing, and the words that were 99% true made the mysterious voice that came from the crystal fragment in Hucknan's hand seem very credible. However, what Hakonan didn't know was that these words had also appeared in Hajar Alto's mind when he was exploring the spirit-binding tower with the tribal warriors. At that time, Hajar Alto had used his scimitar as his answer. He personally smashed the soul-binding crystal, the crystal pillar that had mysteriously appeared in the soul-binding tower, into pieces. Retribution will come to your heart. This curse that roared out decades ago when the soul-binding crystal was smashed had now been fulfilled, and the person who helped him fulfill his promise was his new ally Salem's Hucknan. The outside world's help is ultimately not strong enough. The only thing that can really solve a problem is the scimitar in your hand. But now your scimitar is not sharp enough, and your hand is not strong enough to hold the scimitar. The soul-binding crystal that was made into a necklace on Hucknan's neck flickered slightly, and the trickle-like words once again flowed into the heart of the young man who had the ambition to become the leader of all the desert elves. Accept my suggestion and undergo bloodline modification. Even the cowardly Hajar dared to try to fuse with the heart of the beasts. He dared to do it just because he found a research notebook in the soul-binding tower. With my help, there's no reason for you to continue being afraid. You must know that only by controlling the heart of the beasts can you truly control the blazing shadow beast. Those little guys will become your most powerful weapon. These words touched the young chieftain sitting in the depths of the golden tent. He rubbed the lacquer box in his hand and fell into deep thought. This lacquer box contained the heart of the beasts that he had inherited from the person he had murdered. It was not that he had not considered listening to the soul-binding crystal's suggestion before. It was just that in the last conversation with his father, he was told that the heart of the beasts had a side effect of cutting off the ability to reproduce, which made him unable to make up his mind. If there is no present, then how can we grasp the future? The soul-binding crystal saw through Hucknan's concerns. It could not understand the importance of reproduction for flesh and blood creatures, so it could not understand why such a greedy young man would remain so restrained in the face of power that was at his fingertips. However, as the great detective Holmes said, eliminate all the impossible, and the rest, no matter how impossible it is still the truth. After the soul-binding crystal repeatedly thought about it, it finally found the loophole in its previous thinking. So this time, it decided to use a way of confusing concepts to persuade the young chieftain, who was actually very easy to accept the advice of others. There was no doubt that the wise soul-binding crystal had succeeded once again. This kind of success that kept pushing a person in the direction of its own set of plans actually gave the soul-binding crystal a magical item that should not have any emotions, a sense of accomplishment. This was very unusual. As a creation of the ancient soul-binding sorcerer, the soul-binding crystal was an extension of its creator's will. It did not have a consciousness of self. Although it could guide the operation of the soul-binding tower through the knowledge in its memory, it did not mean that it had that kind of powerful power. After the death of the ancient soul-binding sorcerer, although it could still bewitch others, it was only following the operation set by its creator. However, this magical item gradually had a consciousness of self, in the hands of Hucknan, and it gradually found that it had some fluctuations of emotions. The sensitive soul-binding crystal noticed the changes in itself. With the ability of this magical item to think, it dug out the core rules left behind by the soul-binding sorcerer. The creation of self and emotions symbolized the return of the great creator. The soul-binding crystal was no longer just an extension of the soul-binding sorcerer's will. It was also the continuation of the soul-binding sorcerer's life that had already passed away. When the time came, the soul-binding crystal would only need to lead the slaves it recruited back to the soul-binding tower. Surrounded by the beasts, the dark tower would break through the sand dunes burial. Chapter 99. My luck has improved since I left the Acid Fog Canyon Bitwall. The first successful experimental case in my entire academic career appeared on the first night I set foot in that remote material plane. After rigorous practical testing, I found that the strong liquor brewed by the ogres is actually a high-quality biofuel that has not yet been discovered. Fill the fuel tank of the steam power furnace with this liquid energy, and the energy released from its combustion is enough to power my mechanical prosthetic body, which is designed and made by Mr. 21 and Mr. Ricknaz. It weighs more than 300 pounds and can operate for more than 48 hourglasses. Snyder's private research note. Wine helped with conversation, and Blue the Ogre's collection of fine wine was even better. Of course, what Blue took out at this moment was not the strong liquor that was comparable to poison like viper's blood. In order to take care of the ordinary people present, namely, the desert elf Brock, he took out some low-alcohol liquor that had been verified to be non-toxic for everyone to drink. But even so, the liquor brewed with materials unique to the lower world was not comparable to ordinary things such as jujube. Brock the tongue-puller, who had not drunk alcohol for decades because he had been practicing the art of speech, only took a few sips of Blue's liquor before he completely let loose. Under the stimulation of alcohol, the elf, who had been repressed for a long time, even revealed the past of playing with eagles and dogs with his friend when he was a child. While Brock was talking about the past, the others were not idle either. The variety of goods in the bazaar of Coptic City was far more abundant than anyone could imagine. With Blue the Ogre's money, all kinds of delicacies were gathered here one after another. In addition to the roasted camel meat that was the specialty of this restaurant, there were also roasted grouse, fried locusts, charcoal smoked snake, assorted soup, and even a musk ox that was extremely rare in the desert and only produced in the northernmost tundra of this world. Of course, with 3 ogres and a megalosaurus, there was no need to worry about the food going to waste. This dinner could be regarded as a welcoming feast for Keys and the 3 ogre brothers. It lasted from the evening of the day before to the morning of the next day. When they set foot on their journey again, the eternal blaze of the ash plain was already hanging directly above their heads. The elf who had fallen asleep after singing in the middle of the night was now placed in a pavilion on the back of a sand rhinoceros. The high noon temperature caused his body to excrete some sweat, taking away a large amount of drunkenness. Brock struggled to get up from the cushion. He used his hand to press on his forehead that was tingling from the hangover. It had been more than 50 years since he last drank so much. The last time he drank was when he officially became a supreme warrior and drank from Hajar Khan. Drink some morality potion. Mr. Witch Doctor said that it was His Excellency Keys who named it. So it's called energy potion. It will help people who are drunk. Following this sentence, which was not very fluent in the common language of the plane, the speaker put a small water bag in front of the hungover elf. Tongue-taker Brock's muscles bulged instinctively. He did not feel it clearly yesterday, but now that he was right beside him, the elf supreme warrior could easily sense that this human in a coarse gray robe was extraordinary. Brock's muscles were extremely smooth, and his posture and habits inadvertently revealed between his movements clearly showed that he was an expert in combat. Of course, Sacred Warrior Johnson was an expert. Few mortals were capable of injuring a demon lord and then escaping unscathed. However, he had now become one of Key's employees. In the future, he would have to pay off his debts by working in lieu of paying. After buying a few adult sand rhinoceroses in the livestock trading center of Coptic City, the young blue dragon and the 3 ogre brothers voted together against the objections of the majority. Only Snyder disagreed. But in accordance with the principle of majority rule, the objection was invalid. They decided to disguise themselves as a caravan and set off for an adventure before returning to the dragon's lair to rest. As for the content of this adventure, it had something to do with the elf that Keys had saved yesterday. Sand rhinoceroses were a kind of giant camel commonly seen in desert caravans. In addition to their gentle nature and strong endurance, this kind of giant beast was also very heavy. Key's caravan consisted of a total of 6 sand rhinoceroses. One was responsible for storing the materials that Blue and Palu had bought in Coptic City. Another was shared by Sacred Warrior Johnson and the elf Tongue-taker, who had just woken up from a hangover. Ogre Gourmet Blue and his Witch Doctor brother Palu shared a mount. Ogre Blacksmith Nalu, who was extremely heavy, rode on one alone, and the last sand rhinoceros was the leader of the caravan. The young blue dragon, who had transformed into a human form, and the steampunk Demolik, who stayed in the pavilion on its back to direct the caravan's progress. This is the equivalent of the ransom that Brock gave me before. It's a map with the location of the soul-binding sorcerer's laboratory. Keys opened his space belt and took out a brocade box with a map in it. Since Snade was a big shot in the field of magic, he had to consult an expert. I've checked the map. There's only a simple magic circle of the School of Defense on it. It's only used to protect the map from damage. The mechanical prosthetic arm took over the brocade box and took out the map. The half-lich Snade gently stroked the edge of the map with his finger. After a while, he found a thin fiber in a place that even Quess hadn't noticed before. What's this? Keys looked at the thing that his magic consultant had found and asked curiously. Snade used 2 other small spells to identify it. After repeatedly confirming it, he replied, "This is wraith thread. To be precise, it's about 1/10 of the thickness of the wraith thread. As the name suggests, wraith thread is a thread-like material extracted from the wraith of a person with a strong obsession after his death. At the same time, it's also a necessary casting material for several relatively obscure school of necromancy spells. During the casting process, wraith thread can play the role of solidifying the obsession. After solidifying the obsession, the caster can once again use it as a carrier to directly affect the target's behavior." After listening to Snade's explanation, Keys doubtfully asked, "But I've checked it with many detection spells before. Except for the simple magic circle of the School of Defense, there's no other magic fluctuation at all. This is precisely the brilliance of the person who cast this spell. The wraith thread that I just found is only 1/10 of the normal diameter. Even if you carefully observe it, it's easy to mistake it for a fiber burr on the map scroll. The reason for this was that the enchanted map had been unraveled layer by someone. I have to say that this method is very ingenious. It not only destroys the original casting material, but also makes it impossible to effectively detect the spell that was previously attached to it. At the same time, it also very covertly separates the wraith threads that carry the obsession and adds them to about 10 brand new maps. The Demolic, who was patiently explaining the delicate design of the map, did not do anything else. He just controlled the mechanical artificial body to pick up the slightly thin parchment scroll and gently shook it. The magic map that, tongue-taker, Brock needed to use the Dagger of Souls to harvest a living person's life to activate instantly came alive. Lines that looked like blood vessels emerged from the scroll, outlining a path that led to the ancient soul-binding sorcerer's research laboratory. Obviously, this is a trap. These maps are very likely to be spread by the soul-binding sorcerer himself. His purpose is to lure more people to his laboratory. The steampunk Demolic, who only lacked a pipe in his mouth, said with certainty, "Although I don't know the origin of the soul-binding sorcerer, according to your description, I can roughly guess that this kind of caster is somewhat similar to the evil sorcerer. Making chimeras is just a means to explore the mystery of the secret, not the final goal. The fact that the desert elves could find the production nest that was used to mass-produce the blaze shadow beasts in the laboratory marked on the map is very much like a trap that caters to the soul-binding sorcerer's fancy. And this behavior of painstakingly setting up a trap shows the soul-binding sorcerer's current predicament. The soul-binding sorcerer should be very weak at the moment, and even has to resort to deceit to attract some people to go on a treasure hunt before plotting to turn them into his puppets, or even carriers for his resurrection. Snade's words had indeed enlightened Keyes. The situation of ants bullying a tiger, a stubborn stone triumphing over a diamond, was not common in the multiverse. How could a few ordinary desert elves escape from the various countermeasures of a powerful soul-binding sorcerer's research laboratory? Come on, they were not the main characters of the story. The only explanation that made sense was that the ancient soul-binding sorcerer wanted to cast a long line to catch a big fish, so he deliberately went easy on them. And this was undeniably good news for Keyes and his companions. It was just like the maxim that the ogre blacksmith often said, "An axe without a blade is only a stick." According to the route marked on the map, the distance between Coptic City and the research laboratory that the soul-binding sorcerer had set up as a trap was not far. Starting from the city in the center of the desert, it would take about 3 days with the speed of the sand rhinos to reach the target location. It was just that this route would pass through the area controlled by the Samhain tribe. Generally, caravans would choose to take a detour to avoid the desert elves who had been dragged out like hungry wolves by the tribal war for a long time. But for Keyes's caravan, this was not too much of a problem. In fact, the young blue dragon and the Demolic, who were in charge of leading the way, did not even think about this problem. They rode the sand rhinos to the north. The further they went from the civilization, the taller the sand dunes became. The continuous rise and fall of the dunes was like the surface of the sea that had been ravaged by a storm and suddenly froze, reflecting the dazzling golden light of the eternal sun. Originally, the merchants in the desert rarely chose to travel during the day, because the horrifying high temperature would accelerate the consumption of the water they carried. Most of the time, they would choose to hide during the day and come out at night, relying on tents to resist the scorching sun during the day. Of course, if there was an oasis not far ahead, a short, rapid march during the day was acceptable. Chapter 100. The little boys had come early to watch the beheading. The blazing sun gradually disappeared into the distant horizon. This was the time that the Samhain tribe usually chose for the execution. As the people of the desert, out of respect for the blazing sun hanging high in the sky, the Samhain people were rarely willing to let blood stain the sand under the sun unless it was during a battle. Groups of boys did not hesitate to give up dinner and sneak out of the tent. Most of them were barefoot and stepped on the sand quietly without making any sound, like leopard cats. At this age, the desert elf boys would scoff at everything that their elders valued. They despised and mocked all beautiful things. When they saw a cripple who had broken his leg in the war, they would laugh and taunt him from afar. If they saw an injured animal, they would kill it with a stone and take it home for dinner. They would brag about their injuries, be proud of their scars, and maintain a special respect for the disabled. A boy who was missing a little finger could become their leader. They loved violence. When they passed by the houses of the supreme warriors in the tribe, they would always look at the skulls pierced on the spikes with adoring eyes. As for the execution of the beheading personally ordered by the chief, they would never miss the opportunity to feast their eyes on it. However, unlike the eager desert elf children, Epicurus, who was the one being punished, felt like a year at this time. The great merchant who believed that war always affects trade, except for the trade of weapons, never thought that his trading partner would choose to pay with a sword when he was unable to pay his debts. The day before yesterday, this discerning merchant brought carefully selected goods to sell to his regular customers. As a discount for his regular customers, he did not even charge the previous fee for providing important information. But who would have thought that the desert elf chief, in addition to his wallet being emptied by the tribal war that lasted for 2 years, also had a huge deficit in his personal integrity. There was no trial, no questioning. Epicurus, a merchant who came with enough sincerity, was sent to prison and would be hanged the next day with just one sentence. The greedy merchant who insulted the great Samhain tribe will be severely punished. Not only did he deprive the merchant of a chance to appeal, but he also prevented him from uttering a single curse. Under the orders of the chief of the Zazan tribe, the merchant and his servants were all put on a bit that was usually used to control livestock. As Samhain's court, this oasis was like a huge piece of jade lying in the middle of the desert. The lake, which was a few miles wide, was like a sapphire embedded in the jade, shining brilliantly under the afterglow of the setting sun. The tents of the Samhain tribesmen were set up around the lake with abundant water plants, hidden between small patches of palm trees. When the young blue dragons caravan traveled for nearly 2 days and 1 night, they needed to find a place for the sand rhinos to rest for the night. After climbing over a small sand dune, the oasis appeared in front of everyone's eyes. Just as they saw the oasis at a glance, some people also saw the caravan climbing over the sand dune at a glance. Samhain's sentries, who were in charge of guarding the oasis, immediately surrounded the caravan when they saw it. Keyes knew that his trick of disguising himself as a caravan would not fool people with good eyesight. The caravan did not have common beasts such as camels or horses that were more cost-effective. The expensive sand rhinos were only used as mounts and did not carry large amounts of goods. As merchants, there were many shortcomings in their dressing. Except for Jason, no one was wearing the white linen shirt that desert merchants often wore. The ogres and the steampunk half-liches could not wear it due to their size, the elf Brock did not bother to dress up as a merchant, and the young blue dragon was simply too lazy to change his clothes. In addition, all kinds of excellent weapons and equipment were placed in conspicuous places, making everyone look more like bandits than merchants. These were enough to make people suspicious, but at the same time, they were also intimidating. The sentries of Samhain's tribe rode on a kind of mount called moa. This was an omnivorous bipedal land bird that lived in the desert. Because of its wide forked claws, it would not sink when walking on the sand, and its pace was as fast as flying. In just a moment, the Samhain sentries arrived in front of the caravan. Seeing that the group was dressed a little strangely and was obviously not easy to get along with, the leader of this group of Samhain's elven warriors made a gesture behind his back. He asked a few people in the group to leave first and call more people over before he opened his mouth to interrogate them. The language of the desert elves was quite different from the common language of this world. Keys, who was too lazy to use glib words, simply asked Brock in the group to negotiate. The young blue dragon sized up the dozen Moa knights that surrounded the caravan. He found that the weapons used by these desert elves were quite primitive. Not only the arrowheads of the bows and the tips of the spears, but even the scimitars in the hands of some of the knights were made of flint. This was actually a normal occurrence. Except for the human city-states of the Medici Empire, which had the ability to smelt iron and forge steel, other desert tribes rarely saw steel standard weapons. Usually, only those with extremely high statuses or warriors who were especially brave and skilled in battle were qualified to obtain an iron machete. There were very few ogre brothers like the 3 ogre brothers that Kith had encountered in the beginning, who were equipped with decent equipment. As a desert elf, Brock naturally had no problem communicating with the Samhain sentries. Under careful concealment, the other party did not notice that this fellow's words had the accent of the Samhain's archenemy, the Salem tribe. He knew very well that they did not look like the tongue-cutters of the caravan at all, so he did not bother to explain this problem. In fact, he repeatedly emphasized that this team was not merchants, but an extremely honorable mercenary group that relied on their true abilities to make a living. This was the work that the wandering warriors in the desert often did, but under special circumstances, they would occasionally act as bandits. The desert elves did not reject the mercenary group, and some small tribes were also engaged in this kind of work. After getting a reasonable explanation, the leader of the sentries recognized the identity of Keys and the others. Of course, this was also due to the small bag of silver that Brock had subtly handed over. After the alert was lifted, the sentries dispersed one after another, leaving only 2 riders, including the captain, to escort the team to the oasis. Blatch told them that after replenishing their water supply and purchasing food, they would bypass the central lake and head to the other side of the oasis to set up camp and rest for the night. After that, they would immediately depart and ensure that they wouldn't cause any more trouble. In order to show his sincerity, he once again gave the leader of the sentries a small bag of silver as a reward for acting as a shopping guide for the team. With the money leading the way, the 6 sand rhinos smoothly carried the team to the oasis where the Samhain Palace was located. At this time, the blazing sun on the horizon had almost completely disappeared. The prisoners who had been released from the prison fence were pushed to the periphery of the oasis by the warriors. The slightest resistance would be met with a vicious beating from the scabbard. A dozen vultures, who had long been familiar with this place, were already hovering in the sky, waiting for the opportunity to land and taste the banquet given by death. Unlike the vultures, who were flying in the sky, the uninvited sand hyenas, who were also attracted by the banquet, were mercilessly expelled by the warriors due to the consideration that there would be nobles and children who might come to join in the fun. Riding a black 6-legged horse, the chief of the Samhain tribe came here with his attendant warriors from the Golden Tent. This desert elf noble cherished this opportunity to appear in front of his tribesmen very much. He, who was over 70 years old, still sat upright on the horse's back. His meticulously groomed grayish-white beard accentuated his wisdom, and his tall, solemn guards accentuated his majesty. However, what satisfied him the most was the rusty ancestral armor on his body. But as long as a military expert like Nair the Ogre, who knew the art of war, came closer to take a look, he would find that the rust was actually a kind of waxy texture that took a lot of time to render. Wear this armor, the future king of Samhain. This was what his grandfather had said to tease him. Now that he thought about it, the desert elf chief had a rich aftertaste. Seeing my poor appearance, my tribesmen will love me. This is the banner that belongs to me. Of course, if he wanted to become a qualified king, it was far from enough to be loved by his tribesmen. Reverence was also an indispensable helper for a ruler. At this time, he came to personally carry out the execution to harvest reverence, by chopping off the heads of others. This way of harvesting was simple and efficient. He only needed to say a word, and someone would do the work for him. But this was only for Sheikh Sawin himself. For Epicurus, who was tied up and kneeling on the hard gravel, this method was not easy. After all, no one was willing to use their own head to make a wedding dress for others. However, he was restrained by someone else and even had a chew on him. This great merchant couldn't even speak a complete word, let alone raise his own objection. In fact, Sheikh Sawin was indeed overthinking. At this time, the great merchant did not have the courage to curse at him. If Epicurus spoke, his first sentence would be praise for Sheikh Sawin. Then he would immediately ask for a donation agreement. He would donate all his assets to Sawin, the great desert elf tribe, to fight against the fierce and cruel Salem invaders. Elves of Sawin, what should we do in the face of other people's insults? The sound warlock beside him amplified the voice of the king of Sawin by 100 times. It was clearly transmitted to the ears of every tribesman who stopped to watch. Answer with a curved sword. Let them apologize with blood. The voices rose and fell one after another. Sheikh Sawin, who was riding on a horse, continued to ask, "Is this righteous?" Righteous to the extreme. The desert elves present shouted in unison. The elderly elf stepped off the saddle and dismounted from the horse, displaying his still vigorous skills. He took 2 steps forward and grabbed the curved sword from the warrior who was preparing to execute the execution. He raised it above his head and said, "Let the chief of the Sawin tribe, the nemesis of the sand lizardmen, the killer of Salem, your king, personally ask for an apology on your behalf. How about it?" "Excellent. Excellent. Absolutely correct. Let me borrow your head, my old friend." The old elf chief held the curved sword and leaned close to Epicurus, who was kneeling on the gravel, and whispered in a voice that only the two of them could hear. Chapter 101. The setting sun was as red as blood. Brock's gaze was fixed on the target in the distance, the decapitated merchant and Sheikh Sawin, who was holding a bloody scimitar. There seems to be trouble here. With the superior eyesight of the Megalosaurus race, Keyes could clearly see the torturers from afar. After observing a moment of silence for the merchant leader who had once stood on the same side as him, his attention was attracted by something further away. As the blazing sun had disappeared, black ribbons of shadow appeared on the continuous sand dunes on the horizon. If someone were to close their eyes and look carefully, they would be able to find bits of light and crimson light from the deep darkness. At this moment, Sawin's people stationed outside the oasis were still immersed in their king's impassioned speech. Even the roaming sentries in the nearby desert responsible for the security of the royal court couldn't take care of the abnormal scene in that distant place. A naughty elf child picked up gravel from the ground and threw it at the sand rhinos that Keyes and the rest were riding. Finally, a giant beast that was tired and in a bad mood couldn't take it anymore and let out a low growl at the naughty troublemaker. The troublemaker was so frightened that he sat on the ground and almost cried. Jason, who was standing at the side, calmed down the mount that was starting to get irritated. Then, he took out the candied dates that Blue the ogre had given everyone on the journey and handed them to the naughty little boy. "Looks like this is also our problem." Keyes glanced at the paladin's actions, shrugged, and muttered softly, "There seems to be something over there." Although Brock didn't have sharp eyesight like Keyes, as a warlock who was well versed in the art of sound, he still felt a trace of abnormality from the voice. From this point of view, he was much stronger than the sound warlock who was still unresponsive and serving Sheikh Sawin. However, his senses were still a little lacking. The 3 ogre brothers and the steampunk half-lich were fully armed and surrounded Keyes. As for the paladin that Keyes had just recruited, "Boss, I might need to buy a weapon on credit." Jason rubbed the head of the little boy who was licking the dates one by one and said to the young blue dragon with an embarrassed but firm attitude, "Of course, there was no problem. After the trip to the abyss of hell, Neru, who was never short of strength, became never short of weapons. The weapon supplier to Keyes' party quickly assembled a set of exquisite armor with 3 enchantments: Bull's Strength, Super Balance, and Excellent Offense in Defense for his new comrade from his collection. However, due to the ogre blacksmith's preference for thicker, harder, and longer weapons, he couldn't find a weapon suitable for Jensen's size in his collection. In the end, the paladin could only make do with a forged horse-chopping sword that was more than 5 feet long and needed to be held with both hands. Fortunately, he had enough strength, and with the addition of the Bull's Strength spell on the armor, it was not difficult to use this weapon to fight for a period of time. Do you also need to upgrade your equipment? Keyes looked at tongue-taker Brock and waved the adamantine scythe in his hand twice. After testing the feeling of chopping, he kindly reminded him, "After all, there will be a battle later, and it might not be easy for you." The stubborn desert elf pulled out 2 scimitars and knocked the backs of the scimitars against each other. He replied with a slightly arrogant tone, "It's still easier to partner up with an old friend." Without further persuasion, the young blue dragon signaled to his spell consultant with his eyes. Sneyd, who understood tacitly, raised his mechanical prosthetic hand. After a few gestures, he added 2 temporary spell effects to Brock's 2 old friends that strengthened their hardness and sharpness. The desert elf didn't refuse this help. As a spellcaster who was also a sound warlock, he bowed to Sneyd in a way that mages expressed their gratitude. The steampunk half-lich also bowed in return. The patrol captain, who had been following and monitoring them, was shocked by the strange behavior of these rich people and the luxurious equipment of the entire team. The ogre, who claimed to be a wandering warrior, casually gave expensive weapons and equipment to his teammate. The ogre, who could afford to wear full body armor, the desert elf naturally did not understand the Akatsuki steampunk culture, looked like a human aristocrat, and was actually a mage who could control mysterious energy. "What do you want?" The patrol captain pointed his spear at Keyes and the others. His deliberately louder roar attracted the attention of some tribal herdsmen. Some tribal warriors even took out their own weapons and quietly surrounded them. The young blue dragon calmly walked to the tip of the patrol captain's flint spear and smiled. "We want to fight, but don't worry for now. Our opponents are not you, but those." Keyes' adamantine scythe suddenly slashed in front of the patrol captain, and before the patrol captain could react, his spear was cut in 2. Looking in the direction of the fallen spear and the sharp blade held by the unusually tall and burly young man in front of him, in the darkness of the night that was about to fall, in the gaps of the light from the bonfires of the oasis tribesmen, he could still vaguely see several small red dots on the distant sand dunes. "What is that?" "Blazing shadow beasts. To be precise, it should be a group of blazing shadow beasts." Keyes looked back at Brock, revealing a look that seemed to be both asking and understanding. The former number 1 warrior of the Salem Desert Elf tribe fell into silence due to confusion. As the core member of the Blazing Shadow Beasts project, Brock understood this creature better than his own disciple. This kind of war weapon must be controlled by an artificial organ called the Heart of Beasts. If it was used without any control, this weapon would cause more damage to Salem than to its enemies. This organ needed to be synthesized in the human body to be effective, and it was the only way to completely control the blazing shadow beast. Brock knew very well what price Hadjer Khan Alto had paid and what kind of pain he had suffered. The process could really be called a narrow escape. He did not know if the Heart of Beasts that had been successfully integrated would still be active after being taken out of the body. However, based on his understanding of the strength of Hadjer's body and the abilities of the other researchers in Salem, Brock found it hard to believe that his disciple could accomplish the results of his and a friend Hadjer's 10 years of hard work in just a few months. The desert elf held his blade with both hands and said calmly, "Let's fight and we'll know." The people of the Sawan tribe, who were still wandering around the execution site, also noticed the group of red flashes coming from afar in the dark night. The Sound Warlock standing beside the chief reminded his king, "We can't stay here for long. Quickly gather the warriors in the tribe. I can already hear the sound of death in the wind." The elderly elven chief nodded and pointed at the trumpet guard. The young elven warrior hurriedly put the horn on his back to his mouth, and blew it with all his might. "It's a little late to leave now. Gather all the warriors of the tribe. I want to experience it myself." Sheik Sawin threw back the scimitar that he had taken from the executioner and pulled out the refined steel blade at his waist. He stroked the cloud patterns on the side of the scimitar and glanced at the decapitated Epicurus lying on the ground. He said calmly, "A friend has already told me about Salem's new weapon." Chapter 102. To the people of Salem, the blazing shade beast was something new. These desert elven warriors had not seen this new weapon before. In comparison, the scimitars in their hands and the horses under them made them feel more at ease. Similarly, the dead Hajar Alto had also considered the question of, should we expose this strange biological weapon to the world? In fact, this question had been bothering him for a long time. Although he had paid a great price to fuse with the heart of the beasts that could control this weapon, the desert elven chieftain had kept all the blazing shade beasts in the cave as a backup plan. The number of blazing shade beasts was strictly limited to about 100. But Hucknan Alto, the new lord of Salem, had a different idea. Having served in the nest of production, he was very clear about the danger of this beast. It was only a young blazing shade beast, and when it went berserk, it could easily kill multiple adult desert elves. It was an extremely serious waste to leave such a powerful weapon in the arsenal to collect dust. Furthermore, Huck Keenan was in dire need of an unprecedented victory right now. He needed this to establish his authority and gain the recognition of all the desert elves as the self-proclaimed Khan. He also needed to satisfy the requirements of the soul-binding crystal. It was because of the above considerations that Hucknan finally decided to let the blazing shade beast appear on this dark night, with the enemy of Salem as the audience, to get cheers from them. With the help of the soul-binding crystal, he was able to fuse the heart of the beasts into his body in just one day. Unlike his father's choice, Hucknan did not transplant the beast's heart into his arm. According to the soul-binding crystal, this was purely a waste of the heart of the beast's effect. The desert elf cut open his own chest and cruelly placed it on his young heart. Then, according to the instructions of the soul-binding crystal, after chanting a few simple incantations to activate it, the power of the heart of the beasts was completely released. Although Hucknan fainted in a few breaths due to the lack of blood, when the blazing shade primordial blood accumulated in the beast's heart flowed through the connected blood vessels into his limbs and bones, the young desert elf was instantly awakened by a warm current. When he opened his eyes, the wound that he had just ruthlessly cut open had already healed. His fingers stroked the scarlet scab on the healed wound, and Huck Keenan could clearly feel the pulse inside his body. It was a kind of power that was like an explosive flame, as well as an irresistible desire for blood and slaughter that was born in the depths of his heart. The beast has awakened. The soul-binding crystal made the final conclusion to the evolution process of this ambitious desert elf. Huck Keenan had already completely thrown away any trace of remorse he had for killing his father and framing his teacher. At this moment, he only wanted to show the world the power he had just obtained, and spread the great terror to all the lands he could reach. Men! The new lord of Salem let out a roar that was louder than a beast's. His voice could be heard even deep underground where the tribe reared the blaze shadow beasts. Gather the blaze shadow beasts and set off immediately. We will arrive tonight. When the sun rises tomorrow, I want to drink in the golden tent of the Sawin people. Due to transportation and resources, the distance between the warring parties in this world was rarely more than a day's journey on horseback. Most of the time, the tribal wars in the desert would be decided within a few days. Like Samhain and Salem, who had been fighting for nearly 2 years, it could be said to be a rare occurrence in 100 years. After a long battle, the two sides were familiar with each other's routines. Under normal circumstances, the confrontation between the two tribes was a ritual war. At a specific time, the army would be sent out to fight. As for the surprise attack tactics, both sides, as desert nomads, naturally had a lot of anti-surprise preparations. For example, the patrol system. As the name implied, the patrol was a guerrilla sentry. In the desert less than 100 miles away from the two sides, there were many guerrilla teams composed of elite warriors. Similar to the Moa riders that Keyes and the others encountered before approaching the oasis where the Samhain Palace was located, these patrols did not have a fixed combat mission. The purpose of their existence was to routine alert and guard against the enemy's surprise attack. The patrol teams were generally in groups of 5 and rarely fought when they were attacked. Even if they were forced into a fight to the death, they would timely fire the whistling arrows, made by the sound warlocks of their respective tribes to pass the news of the enemy attack to the nearest companions. Therefore, large-scale military operations between the two sides were rarely not known to the enemy in advance. However, with the blazing shade beasts, the situation was very different. Under the guidance of the Heart of the Beasts, more than 100 blazing shade beasts formed 10 hunting teams. This dangerous synthetic biological weapon was extremely proficient in the stealth joint attack technique. They could quickly dig in the sand, lurk to the side of the Samhain sentries, and then launch a surprise attack. The blazing shade beasts would first attack the Samhain riders on the back of the mounts. The beasts that rushed out of the sand would instantly pounce on the riders and kiss their throat. As for the Moas, they would be taken care of in the next wave of attacks. If the mounts did not die and turn to flee, with the leg strength of these synthetic beasts, they would be able to catch up to their prey in a few breaths of time and burn them to ashes with the blazing flames that gushed out of their bellies. Murder and arson, they were experts. In this way, the blazing shade beasts killed all the way, and none of the sentries escaped to report. Salem's army arrived near the Samhain's court shortly after nightfall. Only 2,000 Salem sergeants followed the blazing shade beasts because it took at least a full day for the tribal warriors of the desert elves to gather. For the young chieftain who had just taken over and had yet to establish his personal prestige, it would take a little longer. Harkonnen, who had long been unable to restrain himself, was naturally unwilling to endure the pain of the burning blood in his heart. Therefore, he only brought his personal warriors along. The ink-black night hid the tracks of the surprise army well. Standing on the sand dune and looking at the oasis where the Samhain's court was located, the young desert elves could feel the high spirits of war in their brand-new hearts. The blazing shade beasts that could also hear the song were infected by the scene of blood blooming depicted in it. However, the synthetic beasts were not ordinary beasts. The more excited they were before the battle, the calmer they were to accumulate their strength. The heat storage organs exposed on the surface of their bodies were gradually compressed by the muscles that gradually tightened. The light that was originally somewhat dazzling at a close distance became much dimmer. After the blazing shade beasts finished drinking, the personal warriors moved the special food troughs made of whole cowhide leather and filled with black oil to the rear of the team. Harkonnen pulled out the sickle-edged sword he was used to using and slashed forward. The young king of Salem gave his order in a tone that could not be questioned. All troops attack. Although they could not understand the words of the desert elves, the song emitted by the Heart of the Beasts was still accurately transmitted to the minds of the blazing shade beasts lying on the sand dune. This group of synthetic beasts that were born to kill all stood up. Under the boiling blood, the heat storage organs in their bodies seemed to be ignited, emitting a dazzling blazing light. Blazing shade beasts charge. Wild beasts that looked like black panthers that had been magnified many times leaped out from the top of the sand dune, alternating between the 6 legs as they moved forward. In the pitch-black night, they used the vast desert as a picture scroll, drawing winding straight lines that dragged the light along the path. Keys stood on the back of a sleeping sand rhino and looked into the distance. Seeing such a scene, he could not help but praise, "You don't say, it's quite beautiful." In order to prevent the sand rhinos from exploding due to fright, the ogre witch doctor gave them some hypnotic potions. At this time, these huge camel beasts had all fallen into a deep sleep. Unlike the calmness of Keys and the others, the Samhain Palace oasis was now a boiling cauldron of voices. The children who had slipped out to watch the fun were all anxiously called back home by their families. Other than the tribal warriors who had gathered quickly, all the men who could pull the bowstring and pick up the scimitar had brought their own equipment and walked out of the house to prepare to face the enemy. Some of the older mothers led the women to the sapphire lake and began to set up leather rafts made of animal leather. In case the situation changed, they could let the children retreat to the safer lake surface first. The Samhain tribe had more than 10,000 warriors who could control bowstrings. In the oasis where the palace was located, there were thousands of elite warriors stationed all year round. In addition, there were the tribal herdsmen who spontaneously set out to protect their homes. They were all men who could be considered half a warrior when they picked up a sword and mounted a horse. There were also the passing merchants who were passively or actively arranged by the Samhain warriors to assist in the battle. Keys and the others were among them. Sheikh Samhain attached great importance to the enemy. However, although he had obtained information about the blazing shadow beasts from Epicurus, whom he had borrowed the head of, and had taken countermeasures with a serious attitude, when the battle broke out, he realized that he did not seem to be fully prepared. The first wave of enemies was the patrol team that was originally wandering around the palace. At this time, they were shouldering the heavy responsibility of stalling for time for the Samhain tribe to gather forces. Dozens of warriors riding moas were divided into two groups. They launched a pincer attack on the blazing shadow beasts from both sides at the same time. This kind of pincer attack formation was the desert cavalry's conventional countercharge tactic. It could not only avoid the enemy's spearhead, but also continuously nibble away the army's effective strength from both sides. If used properly, it could effectively achieve the tactical effect of blocking the enemy's charge. However, the charging blazing shadow beasts were far from the opponents that the Moa riders had encountered before. Not only did this group of synthetic beasts have a natural understanding of tactics that exceeded that of ordinary military commanders, but they also had the powerful strength to ensure that their mission could be completed, as well as the courage to face death with equanimity. The main force of more than 100 blazing shadow beasts did not change. They still maintained the charging formation. On the other hand, 2 squads with 10 blazing shadow beasts as a group were divided into 2 squads on both sides. Aiming at the Moa bird riders who were charging at them from the flanks, they launched a sniping operation that seemed to be more appropriate to describe it as hunting. Some blazing shadow beasts ran directly into the sand halfway, while others were still running with all their might, attracting the attention of the Moa riders. Not long after, the scene of murder and arson that had happened in the desert before was repeated. Chapter 103. Compared to the late Hajar Alto, the chief of the Samhain tribe had more descendants. When someone came to attack, naturally, there would be descendants who wanted to show off their abilities, scrambling to be the first to serve. After the sentries set off to stop the enemy's charge, dozens of such Gongsun nobles followed closely behind, each leading a group of elite mounted archers to provide support. The desert elves were skilled with bows and horses. In addition, they were Moas. Due to their bipedal movement, they were much steadier as a shooting platform than four-legged or multi-legged mount. The archers of the Samhain tribe had always had an advantage in the war against the Salem tribe. The dark night could not completely cover the eyes of these elite archers. Under the faint light of the moon and stars, and under the illumination of the fire arrows prepared by the astute archers, they could clearly see the scene of the blazing shadow beasts killing people. Shocked by the killing efficiency of these strange beasts, These Samhain warriors quickly drew their bows and nocked their arrows in an attempt to stop the charge of the blazing shadow beasts with the accurate arrows in their hands. In less than 10 breaths of time after they got into position, the sentries were almost completely slaughtered. There was no possibility of rescue at all. These elite mounted archers lived up to their reputation of being good at shooting. Most of the arrows they shot accurately pierced into the bodies of the blazing shadow beasts that were charging forward. However, this level of attack did not seem to be effective. Some of the archers with better eyesight saw that although the arrows they shot did not penetrate the bodies of the beasts, they spontaneously combusted in a short while. The wounds also quickly healed after a flash of fire. The flint arrowheads that remained in the beasts' bodies did not seem to be a hindrance at all. Biochemical weapons and bows. The difference between these weapons is more than a generation. Keyes could not help but sigh as he watched the Samhain people on the battlefield successively suffer in a short period of time. He then took out the wailing, double-barreled shotgun that he had not used for some time and carefully took care of it, tightening the brass-hinged trigger device, cleaning the dust in the chamber, and loading the dumb-type shotgun bullets with glycerin. From these extremely professional movements, it was impossible to tell that he was actually a master of body tracing. Driven by Samhain's warriors, the young Blue Dragons group and the other unlucky merchant groups were pushed to the front of the battle line to meet the first wave of the blazing shade beasts. Anyone who tried to escape would be greeted by arrows and scimitars from the desert elf warriors. Many of these merchants were so frightened that their teeth were chattering, but even more of them were cursing loudly in all kinds of accents. Samhain's Gongsun nobles and Gongsun nobles had already retreated with their archers. They needed some time to equip themselves with spears and scimitars before they went to prove their bravery. And this time needed to be fought for by the merchants' volunteer army. The blazing shade beasts were synthetic beasts born for war. They weren't picky about their enemies. Whether it was the desert elf warriors or the volunteer army formed by the merchants, as long as they were in their way, they were a good target. In fact, the merchants who dared to plunder wealth through trade in the desert weren't pushovers. The merchant group guards under them could be considered to have some strength when gathered together. At the very least, they weren't defeated in a single blow when they clashed with the blazing shade beasts. However, that was all there was to it. The strength of the exotic beasts charging at them was beyond their imagination. No matter what kind of damage the weapons in their hands inflicted on them, the wounds would heal at a speed visible to the naked eye with just a flash of fire. When the blazing shade beasts fought, even the slightest damage caused by their huge mutated claws could break bones and tear tendons. The slightest carelessness would result in them being dragged out of their formation and having their throats slit. Some of the smarter merchant group warriors saw the throbbing heat storage organs on the surface of the blazing shade beasts' bodies and thought that they might be the vital parts of their bodies. Thus, they mustered up their courage and tried to slash at those places with the weapons in their hand. The result was either that they failed. The skin of the heat storage organs was actually much tougher than it looked. Or, if they were unlucky enough to succeed, they would be sprayed by the deflagration flames gushing out of the organs and be set ablaze as they wailed in pain. This was the tragedy of being a background character. Even if they had the courage to fight to the death, they didn't have a suitable weapon. What was a suitable weapon to deal with these synthetic beasts? A forged steel horse-chopping sword more than 5 feet long, or an ebony flail with an even more exaggerated length and weight were both good choices. The paladins and ogres, who held these two weapons, showed their brilliance in the battle against the blazing shadow beast. Although Quess had said before the battle that this was actually a team-building activity, the paladins and ogres shone brilliantly. The truth was close to that. For the companions of the young Blue Dragon who had experienced the Blood War, the grandest war in the multiverse, even if they had only participated in an unknown battle in a corner of the universe, they were still able to look down on the opponents they had encountered in the material plane at this time. Even if the blazing shade beasts were proficient in concealment and pincer attacks, they were still nothing compared to the high-level demons in the lower realm. Even if these guys came in menacingly, the scale of more than 100 of them was far from comparable to the army of tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands of Thenari demons gathered in the bottomless abyss. It's not a fight at all. Tongue-taker Brock, who had recently joined Keys's small team, couldn't help but secretly click his tongue when he saw the situation after the two who had been by his side for the past 2 days took the initiative to attack. Not to mention the brawny ogre, who was much larger than his own kind and looked like he was not to be trifled with. With Nalu's size, the blazing shade beast was only similar to a slightly larger cat in front of him. When he swung his terrifying ebony flail, even if it was as ferocious as a fusion beast, it still had to consider whether its body could withstand such a blow. Brock originally thought highly of Jensen, but after his performance after he swung his weapon, the desert elf couldn't help but deeply feel that he had seriously underestimated the strength of this man before. The forged steel horse-slaying sword was still not very smooth to use at first. This paladin, who had been dispirited for a period of time, still needed some time to get back to his previous state. But even so, the performance when he swung the sword was still amazing. He didn't use a trace of holy power as support, or it could be said that only a weak amount of holy power was restrained in his body. Jensen only relied on his skillful technique to face the attacks of the blazing shade beasts head-on. He twisted his waist and pulled in his abdomen, and the strength was transmitted from his heels to his wrists, driving the greatsword held in both hands to slash from the bottom left to the top right. Although it was just an ordinary uppercut, both the timing and the strength could be said to be perfect. This move, which had both the effect of slashing and blocking, not only succeeded in stopping the fusion beast's pouncing momentum, but also left a wound that was almost completely cut open between its chest and abdomen. Ew! Woo! The blazing shade beast let out a miserable howl, but before the sound could reach the ears of its companions in the distance, Jensen's consecutive attacks came like a shadow. Taking advantage of the beast's pain, the paladin leaped up slightly and used the horse-slaying sword from top to bottom to skewer its head into the sand. After the successful blow, he immediately pulled out his sword and turned around. With the help of the force generated by the twisting of his waist and abdomen, with a spiral of accumulated power, he slashed at the sneak attacker who had jumped out from where he was originally standing. In a flash, the two fusion beasts that were still showing off were both beheaded. Although it was thanks to the equipment given by the ogre blacksmith, it still had to be said that Jensen's swordsmanship was really amazing. Chapter 104. Unlike the dazzling fighting style of the ogre Neru and the paladin Jensen, the tongue-taker did not have any outstanding performance after joining the battle. This desert elf supreme warrior, who was good at using dual swords, carefully controlled his weapons and constantly wandered between the battle groups. He did not use the sound technique to fight because it was very likely to expose him. Although it was still uncertain whether Hucknan had successfully merged with the heart of the beasts, it was very likely that this tyrannical patricide was hiding not far away at this moment, secretly observing the situation here. As expected, at this moment, Hucknan was indeed leading the six-legged horse and standing on the sand dune. Originally, the young chief of the Salem tribe was prepared to lead his personal warriors to attack the Sawan king standing under the banner of the Great Banner after observing the enemy's tactical formation. In his expectation, the Sawan army should soon collapse under the attack of the blazing shadow beast. However, some small troubles affected Hucknan's decision. Because of the transplanting of the heart of the beasts, an inexplicable bond had appeared between him and the blazing shadow beasts. In fact, not only could he control the blazing shadow beasts through this connection, but the blazing shadow beasts could also influence him through this connection. At this time, the fusion beasts came out in full force, and they passed this emotion to Hucknan. The heart of the beasts in his chest also accelerated because of this, and the blazing shadow primordial blood rushed through his blood vessels to his limbs and bones. This sudden change shocked Hucknan. The young desert elf chief did not even have time to pay attention to the situation on the battlefield. He did not notice that the blazing shadow beasts were facing a tough obstacle at this time. In fact, he had encountered the violent ogre when he robbed a caravan before. Hucknan's palm suppressed the beating of the heart of the beast. The strength was so great that he even dug out the enamel decoration on his chest armor. Don't be nervous. Just let the other warriors attack first, and then follow the heart of the beast. The words of the soul-binding crystal came like timely rain, calming Hakkinen down a little. He regained his spirit and gave a new order to his personal warriors behind him: charge to the death. The target is the false king of Samhain. Attack. This time, the young Salem elf chieftain tightened his grip on his sword, unlike how he always took the lead when he launched the charge to the death. As for the group of blazing shadow beasts at this time, due to the severe warning from Quest Team in the Merchants' Revolutionary Army, these smart fusion beasts immediately scattered and gave up on this difficult bone to chew. For them, their desire to kill would eventually yield to their tactical goals. Compared to the Merchants' rebel army, that had a group of true monsters, the true goal of the blazing shadow beasts was to disrupt the Samhain elven formation that had already gathered and eliminate the tribe's living forces. Without the guidance of the heart of the beasts, these battlefield hunters who were well versed in the art of avoiding the enemy's main force and attacking the enemy's weak points sneaked into the sand in batches. Quickly leave this place. The merchants in the rebel army raised their arms and shouted. With the retreat of the blazing shadow beasts, the pressure on them was greatly reduced. The quick-witted ones immediately seized this opportunity to call for everyone to escape from this troublesome place. The Samhain elven army began to be attacked by the blazing shadow beasts. Exhausted from dealing with them, they could not spare any manpower to intercept the fleeing merchants. At the same time, Hakkinen's charge to the death also came unexpectedly. The horse team swept over from afar and plunged straight into the Samhain elven formation, their vanguard pointing directly at the big banner in the middle of the formation. Because the camel beasts that the warriors of the Samhain and Salem tribes rode were different, the fusion beasts did not have to worry about accidentally injuring their allies. Although they did not have the concept of allies, they had just suffered a great loss under the hands of Key's companions. They rushed out of the sand and launched a retaliatory attack on the Samhain elves. With a surprise attack, relying on the weight and the grip of the aberration's forelimbs, they could often instantly drag the Moa riders and their birds into the sand pit beneath them. The riders who were ambushed did not even have time to react before their lives were reaped by the sharp claws and teeth. What's more, where the Samhain warriors gathered together, there would often be a few blazing shadow beasts gathered together. The heat storage organs on their bodies were agitated, pumping out large amounts of blazing flames to break through the surface of the sand. Blood and flames, the Samhain warriors experienced the pain with their own eyes. Blood and flames, the blazing shadow beasts could enjoy a feast of slaughter. Old elf, you seem to need a little help. A voice came from behind the chief of the Samhain tribe, who was frowning because of the situation on the battlefield. After digesting and analyzing the ancient power dragon scales, the young blue dragon had obtained many of the abilities of the legendary Megalosaurus. Now, even if he did not use spells, he could achieve the effect of high-level invisibility just by controlling the refraction of light. This made Keys, who could only use the Kang's stealth route, become a stealth expert comparable to the top rogues. With this unique skill, he easily walked step by step to the center of the Samhain tribe's formation without anyone noticing. Quest didn't forget about his disguise, and this was the perfect opportunity for him to do some marketing. How could he give up such a good opportunity when he had not had enough fun role-playing? If he wanted to do business, he had to find the right customer. So after asking, Keys's figure appeared out of thin air in a flash. This made the guards and the sound warlock standing beside the chief of the elf tribe turn pale with fright. It looked like they were going to join forces to attack this door-to-door salesman, if there was any disagreement. The Zazan chieftain was the only one who remained calm. This old desert elf had the wisdom and experience that time had given him. He knew very well that if such a master who could silently sneak up to him just wanted to take his life, he would have succeeded long ago. "Who are you? Why are you here?" Stopping his subordinate's reaction, the Zazan tribal chief calmly asked the young blue dragon, who had transformed into human form. Keys showed a smile that a certain Yugoloth merchant had seen many times and unforgettable, and replied loudly, "A merchant is naturally in pursuit of profit, an elf of Samhain." Due to the concealment effect spell, there was a corner of the battlefield that no one paid attention to. The three people who were not very interested in the battle were excitedly studying the few blazing shadow beasts that were killed. This is the kind of beast that can roast itself? Out of interest in fresh ingredients, Brew took out his whaling harpoon and cut off a piece of meat from the synthetic beast. He put it in his mouth and tried to chew it, then spat it out. "It's so hot and the taste is terrible. There's a strange smell that can't be removed." Looking helplessly at his greedy brother, the ogre witch doctor took out a potion to treat burns and handed it over. "Mr. Paru." Snader, who was concentrating on the dissection, carefully took out a piece of heat storage organ from the blazing shadow beast. He had tried several times before, but it ended in failure. Once this organ was cut, the heat contained in it would be released violently, and even the heat-resistant flesh of the synthetic beast would be burned. It seems that we have underestimated this biological weapon before. In the palm of the Demolika's mechanical prosthesis, the pieces of the heat storage organ that had been taken out were restlessly changing forms. This organ, which was collected from the blazing shadow beast that was beheaded by Jensen, was still alive. The self-destruction phenomenon during the dissection was more like a kind of self-protection. With some conjecture, Snader tried to use the evocation spell, Burning Hand, to directly heat the pieces of the organ in his hand and then reimplant them into the blazing shadow beast. As expected, just like a car that had run out of gas, the dead chimera showed signs of regenerating after its head was severed. The genetic characteristics of the troll and has been optimized. Seeing this situation, Paru immediately made his own conjecture. The ogre witch doctor signaled to Snader, and the latter made a "please" gesture with the mechanical prosthesis. Strong acid gushed out of the troll's skull staff and covered the section of the blazing shadow beast's head that was still sprouting flesh. The dead synthetic beast twitched and struggled as if it had been electrocuted, and thick smoke came out of the hidden exhaust holes on the side of its body. The acid was still effective. Chapter 105. If the blue dragon is dealt with properly, it can be said that it is the most agreeable of the pentashade dragons. When mortal merchants communicate with them, if they know how to make profits, very few blue dragons will choose to resort to force. They will often use methods such as collecting taxes, trading, the terms of both sides are not equal, and negotiation to obtain profit. As long as there is no enmity between them, even if they meet a metal dragon that contradicts their beliefs, the blue dragon will usually only expel them. There is rarely a precedent of directly attacking with the intention of killing the other party. The only exception is the brown dragon, which is of a similar faction, also belonging to the evil faction, and lives in a neighboring environment, also liking to live in the desert. For this subspecies of Megalosaurus, the blue dragon population will always fight to the death, and vice versa. Dragon researcher Brew, the life of Megalosaurus 2 years was not a long time, but it was not short either. On the Blood War battlefield, 2 years was not worth mentioning. A small-scale battle could take up to 100 years. But it was different in the material plane. At the very least, with the efforts of a schemer who had been carefully lying in wait for many years, 2 years was enough to complete the act of a turtledove taking over a magpie's nest. The dragon's lair was a good example. After Keyes returned from the Acid Fog Canyon through Avernus's portal to another world, he wanted to start a relaxing team game due to his encounter with tongue-taker Brock. He did not expect that his birthplace had already changed hands, and the one who took over the magpie's nest was the nemesis of a blue dragon, the brown dragon. Previously, when the Duke of Thunder was in charge of the dragon's lair in the Dragonheart Hall, the brown dragon had been carefully hiding its tracks out of fear of Serota's strength. Once the old dragon responded to the Dragon Queen's summons and led the backbone of the dragon group to Hell to participate in the conscription of the Acid Fog Canyon, the schemer could not wait to launch his long-planned usurpation plan. Without Serota in charge, there was no one in the dragon's lair who could fight a brown dragon that had lived for nearly 1,000 years and was in the stage of an ancient dragon. Even the adult blue dragon left behind in the dragon's lair and the Dragonkin clan were no match for it. Like a sandstorm commonly seen in the desert, the brown dragon Cuthillion suddenly appeared. 2 adult blue dragons, as well as the blue dragon priest who was loyal to Serota, and the legendary chief of the Kobold clan, Malongo Sharptooth, were all easily killed by Serota in an unstoppable manner. From then on, the dragon nest changed owners. The remaining young blue dragon and newborn dragon whelps were forced to submit to the despotic power of the usurper and became his slaves. Compared to the blue dragon, the brown dragon's personality was extremely bad. Not only did he like to enslave young Megalosaurus, but he also cruelly exploited the other races living in the dragon's lair. The prosperous dragon-born Kobold clan had long since become a thing of the past. In the past 2 years, most of the newborn kobold cubs would die within a month due to the lack of food. Many caravans had chosen to pay tribute in exchange for protection so that they could safely pass through the vast desert controlled by the dragon nest. But after the brown dragon usurped power, he wantonly slaughtered and robbed the merchants of their riches to fill his personal treasury. Cuthillion's favorite thing to do was to lie on the throne that originally belonged to Serota in the Dragonheart Hall and use his claws to rob silver cars one by one. At that time, he would often eat a whole barbecued packhorse. If he was even slightly dissatisfied, the kobold responsible for making the food would be thrown into his wide and long maw as a seasoning. The brown dragon of the dragon nest had been bitter for a long time. But it had to be admitted that the usurper had the strength to match his brutality. The eggs of this subspecies of Megalosaurus were about the same size as the eggs of red dragons. Newborn dragon whelps were superior to blue dragons in both size and intelligence. Apart from not being good at flying, their wings were too ugly and pitifully small, but they could still fly by relying on magic. In other aspects, blue dragons of the same age couldn't compare to brown dragons. What truly frightened Cuthillion was the magic of the Duke of Thundercrash, as well as the blue dragon whelps that had gathered together due to their social attributes. When Serota ruled this territory, the brown dragon didn't even dare to go out to look for food. He could only hide in the depths of the desert and rely on sand to survive. It was also because of this caution that he had maintained for nearly 1,000 years that the original ruler of the dragon nest didn't even know of the existence of such a nemesis. The blue dragon hides in the depths, while the brown dragon appears in the fields. As a subspecies of Megalosaurus, the brown dragon was actually the product of a modification experiment. The first brown dragon in the multiverse was born in the laboratory of the Amasker. They were able to spread across the material plane due to the multiple self-destruction and migration of the Amasker civilization. Similar to what happened to Keyes, Cuthillion was inextricably linked to the Amasker civilization. However, the latter didn't have such a long history. He was actually created by an ancient soul-binding sorcerer who knew of the Amasker brown dragon's modification technology. His dragon egg was formed about 1,000 years ago. Because it was an artificial Megalosaurus, the brown dragon didn't have a complete draconic heritage like the blue dragon. While they had a certain advantage in terms of physical and intellectual strength, they suffered from a lack of systematic knowledge, and their attainments in the field of magic were usually limited. After the sudden death of the soul-binding sorcerer, the brown dragon successfully escaped from the laboratory. From an enslaved beast to a stray dog hiding under a sand dune, there was not a single day in the past 1,000 years that Cuzelian did not wish that he could master the profound art of magic. With the departure of the blue dragon Sirota, the brown dragon finally had a good dragon life. Having enjoyed the thrill of being the master, Cuzelian naturally didn't want to be under someone else's control again. However, he also knew, as the enslaved kobolds and young blue dragon had told him about Sirota's departure with the dragons, that while the bloody battle was fraught with danger, the mountain that had once weighed on his head could very well reappear one day. It wasn't until a crystal fragment appeared in his treasury that he finally found a solution to his troubles. After robbing a caravan, the brown dragon was inspecting the spoils of war that he had obtained. Suddenly, he found the crystal that was somewhat familiar to him. "Cuzelian, my servant and successor." A voice suddenly rang out in the mind of the brown dragon, who was carefully examining the crystal fragment with his claw. Suddenly, memories that had been sealed for 1,000 years were unlocked. Memories of his childhood that he couldn't bear to recall jumped into his mind. The brown dragon, who was already at the age of an ancient dragon, suddenly felt an unstoppable sense of fear. He felt as if he had turned back into a weak young dragon. Forcing himself to calm down and suppress the fear in his heart, Cuzelian wanted to completely destroy the crystal fragment that was obviously related to its creator. However, the following words of the voice made him give up on his initial thought. "When you hear this voice, I will already be dead." However, the skills and treasures of the great soul-binding sorcerer should not be buried. "Megalosaurus, who has become very powerful, please accept my test and collect the other 2 crystal fragments. With them, you will have the right to become the new master of the soul-binding tower and inherit the magical powers that I was once proud of." "You are the soul of the soul-binding sorcerer?" Cuzelian thought for a moment and asked. "No, I am only a tool to repeat what has already been recorded. I am only the key to opening the soul-binding tower." The crystal fragment flickered and the voice in the brown dragon's mind answered, "Soul-binding crystal is my current name." Chapter 106. Language was a power that was often neglected. A good speaker mastered 7 basic principles. Host and guest, lying in the background, setting off, taking care of, opposing, saving words, and being subtle. By doing so, he could put the hearts of others into his own hands. Whether it was pecking, cleansing, punishing evil and persuading good, or covering up mistakes, it was all out of one's own will, and no one would disobey. The soul-binding crystal was an expert in using this kind of power. In just a few words, not only did he get himself out of the predicament of being destroyed, but he also put the second king of the dragon nest into the hub. Listening to his inner need for magic power, Cuzelian temporarily put aside the happy time of resting in the Dragon Heart Hall and began to prepare for his studies. Under the guidance of the soul-binding crystal in his hand, he easily unlocked the first mission target, the heart of the beasts and the soul-binding crystal that belonged to it. Unlike other Megalosaurus, brown dragons did not like to roam in the sky. They preferred to sneak quickly on the ground. Under the careful service of the Dragon Nest clan, Cuzelian, whose body had become a little bloated, went straight into the depths of the ground and swam quickly toward the target with his claws, as if he was paddling water. Just follow the beast heart. This was the message that the soul-binding crystal in Huck Nan's body gave to him before he gave the order to charge to his personal warriors. Chief Salem had always obeyed the words of this new friend beside him. It was just that after the real close combat, he suddenly felt a little at a loss. He could still control himself when he was a little far away, but now the group of blazing shadow beasts, which were closely connected to the heart of the beasts, was close at hand. The impact of the blazing shadow beasts on Huck Nan was comparable to that of a stormy sea. But how could the beast heart direct him to move forward? In between the violent pumping of his heart, the young desert elf hesitated for a moment. He could not help but growl in a low voice, "What is the beast heart? What is the beast heart?" Ja! A sonic boom interrupted Hucknan's thoughts. He, who fell behind the charging echelon, suffered a fierce blow. Although he could not see the appearance of the attacker in the dark, the voice that he had heard for decades still made Hucknan's soul leave his body in an instant. Because it was the unique cold voice of his teacher, the tongue-taker Brock, who had been framed by him and had to flee for his life. At the beginning of the Salem warrior's suicidal charge, the sharp-eyed tongue-taker saw Hakkinen, who was dressed in bright armor. What was even more infuriating was that this traitorous disciple actually hid at the back of the team after launching the charge to the death that symbolized Salem's honor. Brock gritted his teeth and said, "What a disgrace to Hajar Khan." Although the former #1 expert of Salem, who was both a supreme warrior and a sound warlock, was regarded as a traitor by the tribe, he had no intention of wantonly slaughtering his former compatriots. Relying on his superb skills and the 2 scimitars in his hands, this desert elf powerhouse was able to maneuver through the chaotic army with ease. With a slash and a swipe of the scimitar, the enemy's weapon would often be blocked or sent away. It would not be blocked at all. Brock's movements were as smooth as flowing water. It was as if he was walking a waltz to the side of his former disciple. He did not use the sound of death to directly kill Hakkinen, who was talking to himself while riding on the horse. Instead, the tongue-taker only used 30% of his ability to use the sound of intimidation to shoot Hakkinen off the horse. He was not only here for revenge, but more importantly, he wanted to teach this traitorous disciple a good lesson, to let him understand what was called honor. "Brat, you've really disgraced me, Anda." Blatch said what he had just said in his heart. The 6-legged horse that Hakkinen was riding was originally tamed by his teacher and given to him. At this moment, facing Brock, it naturally did not have the slightest intention to resist. Seeing that the 2 chiefs were at loggerheads, this smart mount shrugged its broad shoulders and slowly trotted out of the battle circle. "Today we are going to settle this." Brock drew 2 scimitars in the air and calmly looked at his disciple, who he had taught with all his heart. "Let's only compete in swordsmanship. I want to teach you what honor is. My disciple. Beast's heart. Beast's heart? Beast's heart." Seeing that his 5 accumulations were in vain, the young Salem chief restrained his impulse to call for help from his personal warriors. Accompanied by a frantic rhythm in his chest, he followed his former teacher's teachings and held the scythe hilt with one hand holding the blade of the scythe. The blade was held horizontally with the tip slightly tilted. "You are my disciple. You attack first." Without any pretense of politeness, Hakkinen pounced on his teacher. He was very clear about the way this desert elf, who taught him his skills, did things. He would repay kindness and take revenge. This was the origin of the nickname, Tongue-Taker. It was a matter of life and death. The young chief mustered up all his spirit and used everything he had learned in his life. He did not dare to relax for even a moment. He knew that this was different from the daily training he had to do when he was young. If there was a slight mistake, he would not receive a slap from the back of the scimitar but a fatal blow from the blade. "Not bad, at least you did not relax. You have merged with the heart of the beast? Your strength has also increased to a certain extent." Brock waved his scimitars to intercept Hakkinen's attack while paying attention to his footstep. Occasionally he would remind him, "Don't just stare at the scimitars in other people's hands. Look at his footstep. Idiot who only knows how to eat but not how to hit." Although Hakkinen had the advantage of the heart of the beasts and his age, he did not have to worry about the physical strength consumed by attacking first. However, he still did not have the time to be annoyed by Brock's sarcastic words. Even if Hakkinen had learned every move that the desert elf used, he still could only parry and could not fight back. After all, he was the one who was attacking first. Ja! A violent sound wave suddenly came out. However, it was not Brock's sneak attack, and the target of the sound wave was not Hakkinen, who was struggling to defend himself. Feeling the movement under his feet, Brock knew that the blazing shadow beast was lurking and preparing for a surprise attack. Therefore, he took the initiative to attack first. He used the sound of death, with full power to penetrate the sand under his feet. The sound did not sound loud, but the power was quite amazing. After a conical ripple, the sand under the two people's feet sank more than 2 feet. The blazing shadow beast lurking underground gushed out like a gurgling spring. "Your move?" Brock's cold voice suddenly became colder. "It's my turn to attack." As soon as he finished speaking, the scimitar of the tongue-taker turned into a spring thunder and swept toward his disappointing disciple. Hakkinen had also learned these moves. He had even used some of them when he was attacking first. However, in the hands of his master, ordinary moves became magical. What is it? Proficiency. The young chieftain did not even have the strength to defend himself. In the span of 10 breaths, he had been struck 17 times. If it weren't for the excellent protection of his armor and Brock's unexpected choice of places to attack, Hakkinen would have been cut to pieces a long time ago. "Kid, you're still far from enough." He viciously spat a mouthful of phlegm onto the unconscious young chieftain. After spitting, he still felt that it was not enough to vent his anger, so he gave him a kick. "If you weren't the son of Anda, you would have died a long time ago." After saying that, Blatch grabbed the collar of the traitorous disciple's armor with one hand and dragged him out of the battle circle. The unconscious Hakkinen slowly opened his eyes. As blood flowed out, the heart of the beasts increased the rate at which the blazing shadow origin blood was being pumped into his veins. A wicked smile appeared on his face as blood filled his eyes. Hakkinen used his left hand to grab the powerful arm that was holding him. Under his opponent's shocked gaze, Hakkinen thrust the scythe sword he had been holding in his right hand into his master's chest at lightning speed. Just follow the beast heart. Chapter 107. Soul-binding sorcerers were different from warlocks. They were not born with supernatural bloodlines. Their spellcasting ability came from their bloodline modification experiment. This modification was a pioneering work. If it was popularized, even ordinary people would have the opportunity to learn how to cast magical spells. However, there was a side effect that was difficult to solve that troubled every generation of soul-binding sorcerers. Due to the natural barrier between different bloodlines, the soul-binding sorcerers would always have a strong tendency to distort their will, especially their souls, which would become heterogeneous. As time passed, this situation would become more and more serious. There was an old saying among the creatures of the underworld: "The soul of a soul-binding sorcerer is worthless." Although the words of the demons had always been distorted, their sarcasm did point out a problem. Without a strong and pure soul, there was no way to prevent the distortion of one's will. And a soul-binding sorcerer whose will was too distorted would eventually lose control of his spells. Every generation of soul-binding sorcerers worked hard to find a solution to this side effect. They tried to create chimeras to study the relationship between the body and the soul, and then they hoped to achieve the goal of strengthening the soul by modifying the body relatively easily. In the research and development of chimeras, they borrowed a lot of physiological characteristics of the creatures of the underworld who were soul and body as one. Soul and body as one was not unique to the creatures of the underworld, but it was relatively easy to obtain, and synthesize them with similar creatures from the material plane. For example, the chimeras of the blazing shadow beast integrated the characteristics of the Nessus battle dog and the ferocious mastiff of the material plane. Developing chimeras was only the process and not the goal. In fact, the success in creating new types of chimeras did not mean that the soul-binding sorcerers had found the final solution. The final fate of the soul-binding sorcerers of the past was that their souls would collapse, and they would become lowly ordinary people with a distorted mind but no valuable possessions. The only exception was the creator of the soul-binding crystal. Before the modification of his bloodline, he was a talented and intelligent person. After becoming a soul-binding sorcerer, he summed up the experience of the failures of his predecessors and found a new path. He found that most of the failures of his predecessors were due to the influence of monism and mechanism, which focused too much on the parts and neglected the whole. It should be noted that solving the problem of the heterogeneous soul should be a systematic project. He believed that the three aspects of body, heart, and nature must be adjusted as a whole in order to defy the heavens and change the fate. Although he also started with the chimera experiment, he designed 3 different chimeras according to his own theory: beast body, beast heart, and beast nature. He believed that as long as the experiment was successful, he would be able to bind his soul with the 3. He would be able to perfectly resolve the fate that troubled all soul-binding sorcerers through the harmony of body, mind, and nature, replacing human life with animal life. However, in the process of achieving his goal, the most crucial step, soul transplant, required him to abandon his original body and strength. This was an extremely risky choice, so he also created the soul-binding crystal as a backup. Brock lay in the desert with a scythe in his body, surrounded by the sounds of fighting. The loyal companions of the Sound Warlock were gradually leaving him, just like the unworthy disciple who had personally defeated him. "And we can drink together again." The desert elf, whose heart was as hard as a rock, lay quietly. Although there was hatred, the joy of meeting an old friend diluted it. However, 9 out of 10 things in life don't go your way. The ogre and the steampunk lich, who had just dissected the Blaze Shadow Beast and wanted to discuss it with Keys, happened to pass by where Brock was lying. This dwarf elf can still be saved. The clever Brew looked at Brock's chest, which was still moving despite being pierced by a sharp blade, and turned to his elder brother. The ogre witch doctor bowed and pressed on the wound. He nodded and said, "He is indeed quite lucky. His heart is different from ordinary people. It is on the right side. The fainting was only caused by the loss of blood." After saying this, Paru held Brock tightly to prevent him from moving and causing unnecessary damage. At the same time, he grabbed the sword hilt exposed on the elf's body and pulled it out. Then, the ogre witch doctor took out hemostatic white medicine from the medicine bag he carried with him and applied it on the desert elf's wound. Under the effect of the medicine, the wound miraculously closed and stopped bleeding. After his elder brother finished treating the wound, Brew placed the elf on the large gourmet box on his back so that he could take this newly joined dwarf companion away. As for Snader, he dealt with a few Blaze Shadow Beasts that had taken the opportunity to attack. He only left a relatively intact corpse as a new specimen. He carried it on his mechanical prosthetic body and took it away. The 2 ogres' tall bodies naturally attracted more fire. In addition to the Blaze Shadow Beasts and Salem's warriors, some of Sawin's Dinofowl riders also attacked without knowing the reason. Of course, it was still impossible for them to cause friendly fire with their strength. Just as the ogre gourmet was a little annoyed because his path was blocked and wanted to use a fireball to open a path, a huge ebony flail fell from the sky. The ogre blacksmith Neru, the brawny man who always had strength, charged forward. Everyone in his path was thrown off their feet, and he forcibly opened up a path for his 2 brothers to pass through amidst the chaos. "Hee, where did you go just now?" Picking up the ebony flail on the ground, Neru greeted his 2 brothers with a grin. Behind him, following the path he opened, Jensen, who was carrying the horse-chopping greatsword, also walked over. At this time, in addition to the Blaze Shadow Beasts, Salem's chief Hakanan's personal warriors also joined in the battle. The paladins who were unwilling to participate in the vendetta between the desert elf tribes could only pick some Blaze Shadow Beasts in the chaos. But those synthetic beasts with shared vision had already learned their lesson. They all tried their best to avoid this tough guy with superb martial arts skills and only focused on creating death and chaos among the Samhain's elves. Unable to find an opponent for a while, Jensen could only follow behind the arms supplier of Keyes' team, who had just provided him with weapons and equipment, blocking some of the sneak attacks in the back for this ogre with a huge body. On a small platform temporarily built behind the Samhain tribe's army, the young blue dragon pointed to his companions who had gathered together and boasted to the king of Samhain, "Don't think that my price is too expensive. The protection of the dragon nest has always been worth it." The old desert elf chief frowned when he heard this. Previously, he thought that this uninvited young man was just a powerful mercenary leader. Why was he now associated with the dragon nest? Could it be that the legendary new master of the dragon nest, known as the Wild Sand Tyrant by the desert merchants, had already extended his claws and fangs out of his territory? If that was the case, his previous guesses as to why the blaze shadow beasts attacked and why this young man came would be overturned. "Are you the messenger of the powerful Wild Sand Tyrant who rules the dragon nest?" Sheik Samhain asked directly after thinking for a moment. "Rule the dragon nest? Wild Sand Tyrant?" Keyes' expression gradually changed as the desert elf in front of him spoke. Chapter 108. In a rush to improve its spellcasting ability, the brown dragon did not slow down for even a moment. The shards of the soul-binding crystal embedded in its skin acted like a car navigation system, guiding the megalosaurus in the direction it swam underground. "The beast's heart is close at hand," the soul-binding crystal's voice rang in Cuslin's mind. This sentence was like a shot of adrenaline, injected into his slightly exhausted body. "Roar!" The brown dragon exhaled a mouthful of acidic sand and gravel. It swung its powerful arms, and with a light scratch of its sharp claws, a large amount of soil particles fell off. By the time its wide mouth emerged from the desert's surface, the moon was high in the sky. Not far away, groups of tiny creatures were fighting each other. "Don't worry, the beast's heart is as easy as pie to me. I'm determined to get it." Cuslin was not someone Hakonan could compare to. Not only could he communicate with the soul-binding crystal normally, he could even comfort it in his mind when he felt the soul-binding crystal's agitation. Using its front claws to support itself on the sand dune, the brown dragon stomped its hind legs and pulled its body out of the ground like a carrot, leaving behind a huge sand pit that was constantly disappearing. Surprisingly, this behemoth's body had an agility that did not match its size. None of the desert elves fighting in the distance even noticed the anomaly. Undeclared war wasn't a dishonorable act for the cruel and sinister Cusilian. In fact, just like how he ambushed the dragon's lair, sneaking up on the enemy and launching a swift strike was his specialty. The brown dragon's scales were very similar to the color of the desert. When it was born, it was a dull brown, but it became lighter and lighter until it was almost completely white when it was old. Cuslin, who had lived for nearly 1,000 years and had grown to the age of an ancient dragon, had a tendency to turn white in his scales. Walking in the desert at night, he was no longer as stealthy as when he was young. In order to succeed in a sneak attack, the cunning brown dragon used its limited spell-like abilities to summon a sandstorm as a cover for its huge body. The sudden storm was like the wailing of ghosts and howling of wolves, but the desert tribesmen were used to this kind of weather and did not think much of it. Even the experienced desert tribesmen believed that the sandstorm would soon cease because it had started so suddenly at night. However, the wind and sand obscured the brown dragon's figure, but the scent of its body spread. For the blue dragon, this smell was a deep memory that was imprinted in the brain of its race. Berserk sandstorm. It's just an old brown dragon. Standing beside the elderly Samhain elf chief, Keyes' gaze drifted into the distance where dust and sand were rising. Thanks to the ability he inherited from the immemorial dragon, he had long since sensed the force field vibrations caused by the massive creature, Cuthillion, digging underground. He also sensed a familiar scent from afar that he had never encountered before, allowing him to guess what it was that had just arrived. Unlike Keys, the lurker, who thought he had succeeded, did not smell the scent of the blue dragon. Also, thanks to the racial talent of the immemorial dragon, the young blue dragon in human form did not emit any scent. As a megalosaurus, although Cuthillion also had an extremely sharp sense of smell, it was not of any use at this moment. Although he was surprised that he had just learned from Sheik Sawin about the changes that happened in the dragon's nest in the past 2 years of the bloody expedition, Keys obviously did not intend to miss this opportunity. Ask after being beaten into submission, or ask after being beaten to death, was the question he had to consider. Keys was more inclined to the latter. Firstly, it was because of the hostility against the brown dragons in his bloodline. Secondly, it seemed that he had not given his employee, Snade, a job for some time. Thinking of this, the young blue dragon silently put away the wailing, double-barreled shotgun that he had been fiddling with for a long time. In a flash, Keys's figure disappeared out of thin air, swept over the heads of the desert elves who were still fighting, and stepped into the air in the direction of the sandstorm. In addition to our protagonist, who was in this extremely boring tribal war, there was another person who also noticed the brown dragon quietly approaching. A megalosaurus crawling forward? It's a spell-like ability to create a sandstorm. The steampunk Demolic, who was being nagged by Quest just now, could clearly sense the magical waves emanating from the sandstorm in the distance. After casting a simple detection spell, he muttered to himself, "So it's Mr. Employer's nemesis, a brown dragon." Facts had proven that one should never think that magic was omnipotent. The disguise that Cuthillion thought was flawless was like the Emperor's new clothes in the eyes of more skilled spellcasters. But at the same time, it was also necessary to admit that in this world, it was impossible to survive without a good spellcasting ability. Keys, who was under the effect of high invisibility, immediately convinced the ancient brown dragon that it was the latter. The violent sandstorm summoned by Cuthillion was actually not just a disguise. All the creatures within the range of the sandstorm, if they did not have a strong enough body, would be cut by the swirling sand. In addition, in this sandstorm, ordinary people would lose their balance and trip after taking a few steps. Some would even be temporarily blinded by the sandstorm. Summoning a sandstorm was one of the few natural spellcasting abilities mastered by the brown dragon. It could be regarded as a kind of offensive and defensive spell. Using it in an environment like the desert was also a geographical advantage. But the problem was that in a world where magical spellcasting abilities existed, one could never be complacent just because one had mastered a spellcasting ability, because there was always the possibility that some unknown person would pop out and use some other kind of spell to teach you a lesson. For example, Keys' super railgun. A familiar spell, a familiar slogan. The unique spell that the young blue dragon created and shone brilliantly in the lower planes had now reappeared in the material plane. Under the effect of the strong electric field and the force field ability, the cannonball, which was even faster than the cannonball in the acid fog canyon, whizzed out and easily tore the barrier formed by the sandstorm and the sandstorm. A blow to the head and a cannonball to the head. Even though Cuthillion was old and experienced and instinctively used his forelimbs to protect his head when he sensed the danger, he was still half dead from Keys' super railgun. The right forelimb that was directly facing the cannonball was directly blown to pieces, and the left forelimb that was under it was also broken. The huge impact directly caused the broad dragon head of the ancient brown dragon to plunge into the sand and stones below. But a megalosaurus was a megalosaurus after all. Compared to the Thanner re-demon that had suffered such a blow before, Cuthillion's situation was still much better. He did not lose his life directly, nor did he completely lose the ability to resist. Summon Giant Air Elemental. When Goo Brown Dragon's brain was about to shut down, he forced himself to use another talent spell that was his trump card. Chapter 109. Elemental creatures were the embodiment of the elements that made up the air of the multiverse: water, fire, earth, and other elements. When they were in the plane they belonged to, they were almost just living energy, but they could respond to the summoning of spellcasters or other powerful beings, come from the inner elemental plane to the material plane, and perform certain tasks. When the brown dragon grew to the age of an ancient dragon, it would have the innate ability to summon a giant air elemental once a day. Faced with Keys's warning, Cusellian did not hesitate to summon it. After using this innate ability, it was possible to randomly summon 1 to 4 giant air elementals. But the brown dragon was greatly disappointed. At the moment, only 1 giant air elemental responded to his summoning and came to the material plane for him to do his bidding. Go to the beast's heart immediately and swallow it. The voice of the soul-binding crystal, which had always been like a gurgling spring, suddenly became loud and clear, exploding in Cusellian's mind. This is your only chance to escape today. The brown dragon, who was still in a state of concussion, immediately woke up. Just as he was about to ask the question, "Where is the beast's heart?" a series of violent heartbeats suddenly sounded in his ears. This was the last help the soul-binding crystal could give him. Looking at the giant elder air elemental in front of him, which was no ordinary giant air elemental, it was just that he was too inexperienced to recognize it. Kith was a little surprised. He did not think that the seemingly weak elder brown dragon would be so lucky. Unlike ordinary Chi elementals, the Chi elemental elder was an elite Chi elemental. Its funnel-shaped body was made of spiraling Chi clouds, and it had clear facial features. The air elemental elder stood on the ground, and the sand and dust under its body collided and rubbed against each other, making a piercing sound. This was actually an ancient air language, and it was using this language to explain the reason for coming to this plane. Chi Giant Spirit Lord, Brown Dragon, Covenant, Battle. Thanks to the massive amount of knowledge he had inherited when he was a dragon fledgling, Quest could recognize some of the obscure terms in the Elder Chi Elemental's ancient language. When the elemental creature that responded to the summons said the word battle, it directly turned into a gust of wind and swept towards the young blue dragon. This was the most common way to start an attack. In this form, physical attacks, including piercing, slashing, and blunt blows, could only cause limited damage to it. Moreover, with the speed of the gale's attack, the spellcasters who were relatively close to it would not have time to finish their incantations. Sandstorm Funeral. Seizing the opportunity, Gu Zonglong also tried to find a way to help the allies he summoned. The sandstorm that had just stopped after being blown away by the railgun rose again. Under Cusellian's full power, the sandstorm and whirlwind enveloped Keys with a force several dozen times greater than before. The sand and wind turned into a cage that could take a person's life in an instant. They wanted to bury the young blue dragon who was trapped inside. Roar! With a dragon's roar that shook 100 miles, Quest, who had transformed back into his dragon form, used his enormous body to forcibly break through the prison formed by the wind and sand. Regardless of the howling wind and the impact of the sand, they could not damage the diamond-like scales on his body at all. Keys, who had fused with the primordial Energizer dragon's scales, had once again increased his body size by quite a bit. The most direct description of this was the young blue dragon's action of easily grabbing Cusellian's tail with his dragon claws. After activating Sandstorm Funeral, Gu Zonglong, who had been acting like a field mouse from the moment he appeared, immediately wanted to burrow into the depths of the earth. However, the broken forelimb obviously had an impact on his digging speed. Although his dragon body had already burrowed into the hole just now, he did not have time to retract his long tail and was finally caught by Keys. Using a little force field ability to restrain the struggling Elder Air Elemental, the young blue dragon firmly clawed the skin of Cuzilian's tail. Gu Zonglong's scales were only a layer of thick leather, so they were not as tough as other Megalosaurus. With Keys's current sharp claws and monstrous strength, as long as he pulled it out like pulling out a carrot, he could easily crush it in close combat. Perhaps because he was in a hurry to escape, Gu Zonglong actually acted like a lizard. After a few fierce struggles, he actually broke his own tail. Only a low cry of pain came from the hole. Cuzilian did not even let out an angry roar as he desperately fled into the distance. Although he was busy digging and did not see clearly, he still saw the indigo color of Keys's scales. As old enemies, Gu Zonglong and Blue Dragon both understood the hatred of each other. Cuzilian knew very well what would happen to him if he fell into the hands of a blue dragon. Keys put the Gu Zonglong's tail into his space belt and pushed the Elder Air Elemental, who was bound by the force field, towards Snade and the others who were rushing over from afar. As a master spellcaster, Keys knew that the Demolic had many ways to deal with this elemental creature. The young blue dragon focused all his attention on chasing after the Gu Zonglong. Letting a tiger go back to the mountains was already a disaster, but letting a Megalosaurus escape was not a good idea. He did not immediately choose to use the blue dragon's excellent digging ability to drill into the hole and chase after the Gu Zonglong. Keys first sensed the force field fluctuations emitted by Cuzilian as he dug underground. He knew very well how much damage his railgun had done to the Gu Zonglong. As long as he could lock onto the Gu Zonglong's trajectory, the young blue dragon was confident in his ability to intercept a crippled Megalosaurus that had lost an arm and a tail. Keenly sensing the force field fluctuations in the entire space, Keys found that the Gu Zonglong did not escape into the depths of the desert. Instead, he zigzagged towards the battlefield where the desert elves were slightly at a loss. The powerful head-on shot just now had obviously attracted the attention of the warriors of Samhain and Salem. Something big was happening outside the battlefield. Beast's heart, beast's heart, beast's heart. The same shout as the young chief of Salem not long ago kept ringing in Cuzilian's mind. The Gu Zonglong used his remaining front claw to dig in the ground with great difficulty. The soul-binding crystal that was embedded in his body for ease of carrying had been guiding him in the direction he was going. Both of Huck Keenan's hands touched the blazing shadow beast in front of him. Since then, the surging waves in his heart had instantly caused the heart of the fusion beast to beat even more violently. Although maintaining the overload state would affect the lifespan of this biochemical weapon, he knew very well that by paying such a small loss, he would be able to catch something worth more in a moment. The beast's body is close at hand. This was what the soul-binding crystal said to Huck Keenan when the Gu Zonglong first appeared. Chapter 110. The anxious Cuzilian patrolled the ground. The heavily injured Palea Brown Dragon had no choice but to place his hopes on the beast heart guided by the soul-binding crystal. After anchoring the heart that was emitting a tempting rhythm, he mustered the last of his strength and rushed to the surface. He opened his wide mouth to the limit and caught his target in one bite. The few Samhain warriors who were thrown off their horses by the sudden appearance of the Megalosaurus were also unfortunately affected. They were swallowed by Cuzilian along with the blazing shade beast. The battle that happened in the desert tonight was originally between two tribes of desert elves. However, with the appearance of the two Megalosaurus one after another, the battle was quickly overshadowed. Apart from the blazing shade beasts that were still full of fighting spirit, the other desert elves had all scattered in all directions. The Salem warriors could leave as they wished, but the elves of the Samhain tribe could not retreat directly. Not far from the battlefield was their oasis, their home. Although they were far away from the Megalosaurus that broke out of the ground, the Samhain warriors still quickly gathered near their chief. The old elf chief had long been in a state of panic. Although the teachings of the former king and the baptism of time had taught him a lot of knowledge, none of the precious treasures that he thought he cherished could be used now. The appearance of one megalosaurus was not enough. Two megalosaurus that were born with hostility had appeared at the same time near the oasis that the Sawan people relied on for survival. Retreat first. Suppressing the fear in his heart, the old chief knew that at this moment, he was the backbone of all the Sawan elves here. He could not show the slightest hint of panic. He could not stay in a dangerous place for long. Being dragged into the battle between the two behemoths was no joke. The only thing he could do was to temporarily avoid the battle between the two dragons. After that, no matter who won, he could use the power of his tribe to lure the other with wealth. The sudden retreat of the Sawan tribe made the Salem warriors, who had launched a surprise attack tonight, hesitate. When they encountered such a situation when they launched the charge to the death, they should have chased after the enemy and fought to the death. However, the huge brown dragon was right in front of them, and the young leader was nowhere to be found. Even the most resolute warrior would be shaken by these two factors. In the end, the charge to the death, that symbolized Salem's honor, had to come to an end. The retreat of the desert elves did not attract Cusilian's attention. The brown dragon that had just devoured the beast's heart had recovered some of its strength. Just as the soul-binding crystal had pointed out, he found that the beast heart was indeed very beneficial to him. His severed forelimbs and tail began to grow granulation at a speed visible to the naked eye. His own heart also began to pump powerfully like what he had heard before, producing violent rhythmic sounds. His originally withered spirit and exhausted physical strength also miraculously recovered. These changes greatly increased Gu Zonglong's confidence. He began to have the courage to look at the enemy who had just beaten him with only one blow. However, at this moment, the soul-binding crystal hidden under the scales had turned into a pool of liquid and soaked into the giant beast's body. Wild sand tyrant? Under the support of the force field, the young blue dragon flew in the air and greeted Cusilian, the second-generation leader of the dragon nest, in a joking tone. Keys clearly saw the brown dragon's action of swallowing the blazing shadow beast just now. The reason why he did not stop it was because he had a vague guess after hearing some of the findings from Paru and Snade's dissection of the fusion beast. Just like Cusilian's trick of taking over the nest, was it possible that Heart of the Beasts and Brown Dragon's ambush were the backup plans of the soul-restraint sorcerer who had been weakened to the minimum to reincarnate in another body? Looking at the angry brown dragon, Keys could not help but observe a moment of silence for 2 seconds. When eating, one must look clearly at what one is eating. It is okay to eat carelessly. The young blue dragon, who had the ability to sense the force field, naturally would not be indifferent to the strong pulsation of the heart of the beasts. In fact, he had already discovered that the blazing shadow beast swallowed by Gu Zonglong was just a cover. The real heart of the beasts was still in Hakanan's chest, and the young elf chief of Salem, the villain who killed his father and usurped the throne trained by Brock, was now hiding in the swallowed organs and entered the dragon's stomach together with the cover. The mantis stalks the cicada, unaware of the oriole behind. "What dragon are you? Why did you hurt me?" Cusilian stared at the guy who attacked him. He did not look carefully just now and thought it was an ordinary blue dragon. But now that he opened his eyes and saw Keys's appearance clearly, he could not help but be puzzled. What kind of megalosaurus was this? A blue diamond dragon? A blue crystal dragon? But Gu Zonglong was not asking sincerely. He was just using this question to cover his counterattack. Cusilian felt that most of his strength had recovered, and his broken limbs were growing back. Just after he roared at Keys in Draconic, the cunning and cruel guy spat out acid breath at the young blue dragon. Not only that, Cusilian followed up with his innate ability and pounced at his opponent with all his strength. He believed that Keys's spells were more threatening. The memory of the cannon blast that stunned him was still fresh in his mind. He did not dare to be careless. But when it came to strength, if the strength dragon claimed to be second among the megalosaurus, No other megalosaurus would dare claim to be first. Keys had gained many abilities that only the strength dragons possessed through passive evolution, including their unparalleled strength that far surpassed their peers. Keys ignored Guzonglong's acid breath. This sneak attack did not even touch the young blue dragon's body. Under the effect of field, it was pushed to the side. Keys simply pounced at his opponent. Cuzelian's slaps and heavy blows had no effect on the surface of Guzonglong's scales, but his sharp fangs could easily tear through Guzonglong's already weak scales. The young blue dragon lived up to his nickname of Gigantic Skull. He was good at using his mouth when it came to melee combat. He took the opportunity to bite Guzonglong's neck. He clenched his jaw and the sound of bones breaking could be heard from Cuzlin's neck. Megalosaurus had a strong vitality, and Guzonglong was not completely dead after eating a part of the beast heart. Keys threw Guzonglong's limp opponent on the sand and flipped him over with his claw. With a slash, Quest Dragon Claw slashed across the ancient brown dragon's chest and abdomen, completely slicing it open. Hot dragon blood gushed out like a fountain. The scene was horrifying. Unlike Guzonglong, Pentachet dragons did not eat their own kind. Generally speaking, even if a blue dragon killed its mortal enemy, Guzonglong, it would only burn its bones and scatter its ashes. It would not do such a thing. But now there was something he needed to find. Looking at the terrified humanoid monster lying on top of Guzonglong's heart, Keys revealed a sinister smile. "Hello, Mr. Harknan. Let me send Brock's regards to you." As he spoke, Guzonglong's claw shot out a strong fork-shaped electric current, burning Guzonglong's body from the inside out. As Guzonglong's beast heart and beast body died at the same time, the two soul-binding crystals that guided them gradually merged together. Chapter 111. Khedive had a good name. Everyone in Gnome City knew that. He had originally been a stable guard serving the Archon of Gnome City. It was because of his name that he rose to prominence overnight. "What is your name, boy?" "My lord, my name is Khedive." "Oh, you have a good name. You shouldn't spend the rest of your life in the stable." This anecdotal conversation was spread by the other servants who also served in the city lord's manor. Everyone in the city of Gnome was aware of it. It was because of this that there was a trend in Gnome City to invite scholars to name new children. Every time he heard rumors about his name, Khedive would laugh. Mediocre people always bring trouble to themselves. Khedive was no ordinary person. He had been born with a crystal shard in his mouth. Everyone in the neighborhood had praised him for being successful when he grew up. When he had just become a teenager, Gnome City had been struck by a plague. The people who lived there had either died or fled the city. 9 out of 10 houses in the city had been deserted. Khedive's parents had also perished, but what was surprising was that he, a helpless child, had survived the disaster and survived. After the Great Vexer had the spellcasters remove the source of the plague, he had sent a new Archon to oversee the area. Khedive had used some unknown method to get into the Archon's stable in just a few days to earn a living. In less than 2 years, after that conversation with the Archon, Khedive had been entrusted with an important position. First, he was in charge of the daily necessities in the Archon's manor, then he was in charge of managing the Archon's businesses in Gnome City. Finally, he was in charge of all the business activities of the Archon's family. He was only in his early 20s. Even the beard he had deliberately grown out was just a layer of soft stubble. Yet Khedive had already become the Shadow Archon and Lord of the City in Gnome City. All of this was thanks to the crystal in his mouth when he was born. When the plague had struck, the crystal had communicated with Khedive for the first time. The boy, whose parents had died and had no one to rely on, had been fortunate enough to avoid danger several times because he had followed the crystal's advice. As for the name Khedive, it was it that made the boy change his name to Khedive. Khedive is a noble title in ancient times, meaning governor. As the owner of the soul-binding crystal, you deserve it. Unlike many people who were spoiled and arrogant, Khedive had always maintained a humble attitude. Even though the consul had promoted him from the stable and appointed him to the post, he still lived in the hut next to the stable. The consul had personally chosen a luxurious residence for him in the city, and it was only the place where he handled his daily work. "My lord, one cannot forget one's roots." This was the answer that Khedive often told the Archon. Every time the 50-year-old consul heard this, he would pat his bulging belly and pretended to be fierce. "Humph! You little brat, you're really good at taking care of the stable. Then you'll have to take good care of my horse for the rest of your life. Unappreciative brat." However, no matter how many batches of people who knew the secret because they served the consul were secretly dealt with, the next batch of people to be purged would never have the name, "ungrateful brat," on it. Instead, every time the consul issued a private reward, no matter how small the reward was, Khedive would always be first. Khedive had always been attentive to the consul's orders, even if it was a joke like, "Take care of my horse." After learning the knowledge of the soul-binding crystal's chimera modification experiments, he had an outstanding advantage in breeding new mounts. The consul was getting older and heavier. Adding on the fact that he always had to wear the ceremonial armor, even if a normal horse could bear the weight, it was still very uncomfortable to ride. Often, he had to put a thick layer of beast skin under the saddle to prevent the consul's butt from being jolted when he rode. Khedive volunteered to offer the consul the new breed he had bred, the man-bearing horse. The back of this mount was covered with a layer of oily soft flesh. The saddle did not need beast skin under the saddle, and the rider would not feel the hardness. It had the bloodline of the six-legged horse commonly seen in the desert tribes, and its 6 legs could support the weight of its body. The man-bearing horse had a fierce personality, and would not be frightened in battle even if it was hit by an axe. Finally, and most importantly, this mount had extraordinary intelligence. Even if the saddle was not tightened, it could be controlled by its master's words alone. The consul of Nome naturally treated such a fine horse as a treasure. After rewarding Khedive again, he ordered him to cultivate more of this type of horse. However, as a chimera, the man-bearing horse did not eat normal coarse grain, and would not eat without meat. Its food had to have fresh meat in it before it could eat. Apart from Khedive, this ferocious chimera could harm any servant who fed it. Cultivating this kind of mount was very costly, but as the consul's favorite, these expenses were naturally compensated by the new taxes distributed to everyone in Nome City. In fact, this was not the first time the Shadow Consul had done something like this. The gambling dens in Nome City, the money-printing houses that provided loans and collected interest. Khedive's shadow was often behind any business that involved the consul's family. Coupled with the horse tax he had incurred because of the man-bearing horse, the people of Nome began to refer to Khedive as man-bearing horse. "Everyone in the city calls me man-bearing horse." "You don't say, it's quite fitting." Khedive sat in the consul's mansion handling matters, sipping a drink made from hibiscus juice as he said calmly, "I am indebted to the consul's favor, so I naturally have to work hard for my lord and do some man-bearing work." Standing in front of him was the boss of the Sand Rhino Caravan, Santos. This wide and fat merchant kept wiping the sweat off his forehead as his mind raced, thinking about how to deal with this difficult situation. "Looking at you, you still know how to be afraid. Why do you refuse to transport goods for us? Also, the only reason moon candy is sold in Nome City is because of the recipe scroll you brought from Coptic. Now that we lack the raw materials, shouldn't you personally take care of this matter?" Khedive slammed his cup on the table in front of him, like a hyena that had locked onto its prey, staring at Santos in front of him. What should he do? Even though the boss of the Sand Rhino Caravan had done some shady business before, he considered himself a proper businessman and did not want to be involved in any business related to moon candy. "Mr. Khedive, I don't mean to shirk responsibility this time. But as you know, the the current trade route from Nome to Kotpu not only has to avoid the conflict zone between the Sawan and Salem tribes, but the original route through the Dragon Nest territory has also become a dangerous one due to the existence of the megalosaurus known as the Sandstorm. As for the other routes, they will all pass through other cities. If the raw materials for moon candy are found among the goods, I don't care if I die, but if the raw materials are taken away, won't that delay your business even more? Chapter 112. Khedive looked up at the sweaty fat merchant in front of him. He did not comment on what the merchant had just said. He stood up, walked around Santos, and approached the windowsill of the room. The mansion that the consul had bestowed upon him was the collateral of a fallen noble. The windowsill was 3 feet above the ground, and it was decorated with precious transparent glass. Not only did it allow the people in the house to clearly see the streets of Nome City from the 3rd floor, it also allowed the bright sunlight to shine in and illuminate every inch of the house. The castellan liked this design very much. It was one of the few noble creations in the house that he had personally ordered to be preserved. Khedive's favorite enchanted chessboard was placed in front of the window where the light was the brightest. Whenever he had free time, he would look out at the streets of Nome City and play a game of chess with his hand. Chess of Wits is a game that tests a person's wits and strategy. Compared to it, the card games that are popular in gambling stalls are just cheap tricks. Khedive picked up a chess piece that symbolized a strategist and placed it in the middle of the chess pieces of the 2 opposing sides. Under the effect of the spell, the tactician chess piece was attacked by the 2 dogfighting chess pieces at the same time and fell out of the chessboard in a flash. Look, if you put the chess piece in the wrong position, even your own chess piece will attack you mercilessly. Khedive smiled warmly as he watched the boss of the Sand Rhino Caravan's fat body start to tremble. He picked up the tactician chess piece outside the board and walked in front of Santos. He said condescendingly, "But there is no need to worry too much. As the saying goes, a fall into the pit, a gain in your wit, and a wise man will always have a good idea. Mr. Santos, you should go back and make the necessary preparations for your departure. But don't worry, there will be more time this time." When Khedive saw the fat merchant walk out of his mansion shakily and sit on the palanquin carried by his servants, he continued to play with the chess piece. He didn't even look at it before he moved the most inconspicuous piece on the chessboard forward. Because the watchdog had attacked the tactician before, this little soldier walked to the enemy's bottom line without any hindrance. A burst of magic light flashed, and in an instant, the pawn chess was upgraded to the king chess, and the offensive and defensive positions changed instantly. As long as you walk to the end, even a small soldier can be called a king. In his mind, the soul-binding crystal hurriedly replied, "Yes, yes." Without the control of the heart of the beasts, the blazing shadow beasts went berserk. They began to attack everyone within sight without fear of death. The compassionate paladin Jensen and the ogre Nalu Shuang continued to pick up their weapons and encircle these crazy fusion beasts. In the end, the other 2 ogres who were worried about their brothers and wanted to obtain more complete experimental materials also joined the battle. As for Keys, he transformed back into a human teenager and began to study the soul-binding crystal that had been combined into one. Hello, powerful and lucky Megalosaurus. A momentary setback couldn't affect the soul-binding crystal that didn't have the emotion of depression at all, and the combination of 2 pieces into one gave the newly formed soul-binding crystal more substantial knowledge. Therefore, when the young blue dragon was studying it, it took the initiative to communicate. "Who are you?" Keys stood up vigilantly, but he continued to listen to the words that emerged in his mind like a gurgling spring. "Who I am is not important, where I come from is the key." The soul-binding crystal continued to explain. "I come from a distant and unknown era. I'm a tool that repeats what has been recorded. I'm the key to opening the soul-binding tower." Soul-binding tower? The blazing shadow beasts and the brown dragon that appeared before were also left behind by the soul-binding sorcerers? Keyes captured the information from the soul-binding crystal's words and raised his own speculation. That's right, the soul-binding sorcerers have been dead for thousands of years, and the existence of those fusion beasts can indeed be called left behind. It's just that because this inheritance was entrusted to the wrong person before, the power of the ancient treasure was also covered in dust in their hands. Covered in dust in the secret? Young, powerful, and lucky Megalosaurus, are you so naive? Do you think that a brown dragon that can be easily defeated by you and a lowly desert elf slave chief are qualified to inherit the accumulation of the ancient powerhouses? They're just the keepers of the treasures, the inheritors of the secrets. The soul-binding crystal's voice that was projected into Keyes's mind suddenly became deafening. Then who and how can get the true inheritance of the soul-binding sorcerers? Keyes asked the soul-binding crystal with a calm and hopeful voice. Get rid of the fences of fate, break free of the shackles of the body and mind. This road of beginning is hidden in the soul-binding tower. But only those who have complete body, mind, and nature can get the qualification to enter. Lucky Megalosaurus, you have 2 of the 3. You only need to eat the corpse of the brown dragon that has begun to integrate with the heart of the beasts, and you will have the right to inherit this inheritance. Salem's elf is the heart of the beast, and the brown dragon is the body of the beast. According to you, there's still a carrier of the beast's nature? That's right, young Megalosaurus. Do you desire to become stronger? Hurry up and eat. Sorry, I've been on a diet recently. Could Keyes be bewitched by the soul-binding crystal's words? It was indeed possible in the past, but now, the abundant power of the soul could protect him from any mind distortion effect. In the silver blade reward issued by the Bator bureaucracy with a strange and difficult-to-remember name, it contained all the psionic skills of a respectable Gith sage. Keyes, who was lucky enough to obtain this precious inheritance, easily mobilized the soul-binding crystal and revealed the truth. The 5 fingers of his right hand opened, and a sharp blade with a pale silver brilliance grew out of his flesh. Keyes clenched the silver blade, aimed at the soul-binding crystal in his other hand, and swung it hard. The sound that was originally like a gurgling spring in his mind instantly turned into a wail. However, under the tough psionic barrier, there was no way to hurt the young blue dragon who was protected. In addition to the ability to cut the physical substance like an ordinary weapon, in the hands of the Gith Yankee Knight, the silver sword could also cause damage to incorporeal substances or creatures. Some mages sometimes wanted to enter the astral world for some reason, but they rarely dared to provoke the Gith Yankee. Because once the silver blade cut off the incorporeal silver line linking the astral world projection and the body on the material plane, these astral world travelers would die directly. Thanks to the selfless teaching of the Gith sage, Keyes also mastered this ability. As he expected, when the blade like a pale silver beam passed by, an invisible thin line appeared on the soul-binding crystal. After this thin line stretched out about 2 or 3 feet, it disappeared into the void. You're tuning in to the Phoenix Knights YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.